Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first thing you notice about an empty house isn't the silence, it's how the silence has texture. It pools in corners like stagnant water, thick enough to feel against your skin when you walk through it. My grandparents' duplex in Newark had that kind of silence, the kind that made you hold your breath without realizing it, as if disturbing it might wake something better left sleeping. I'd taken the job reluctantly. 3 months of house sitting while they renovated the adjoining property wasn't exactly the creative sabbatical I'd planned, but freelance design work had been thin lately, and the rent-free arrangement gave me time to build my portfolio. The duplex sat on a narrow lot typical of the neighborhood, 2 identical units sharing a wall, each with its own entrance, its own life. Or so I thought. The longest hallway ran along that shared wall, stretching from the front door to the back bedroom. During the day, it felt unremarkable. Hardwood floors that creaked in familiar places, wallpaper with faded roses that my grandmother had hung in 1987, a single overhead fixture that cast everything in amber light. But houses change at night. They settle differently. They breathe differently. The first time I heard the static, I assumed it was interference from the construction next door. Power tools maybe, or some electrical work bleeding through the shared wall. It started at exactly 2:13 a.m. I know because the digital clock on the nightstand became an obsession, its red numbers burning into my retinas as I lay rigid, listening. The sound wasn't quite like television static. It was more organic somehow, like the whisper of sand pouring through an hourglass, or the soft hiss of steam escaping from something under pressure. It emanated from the hallway, seeming to move along the baseboard closest to the adjoining wall. And with it came the shadows. I first noticed them on the 3rd night, when insomnia finally drove me from bed to investigate. The hallway stretched before me, lit only by the streetlight filtering through the front window. The shadows weren't cast by anything I could see. They moved independently, flowing like dark water along the base of the wall. They had the quality of interference on an old analog television, that muddy, pixelated dance of gray and black. But interference has a randomness to it. These shadows moved with purpose. Sleep became elusive after that. I'd lie in the back bedroom, listening for that first whisper of static that announced their arrival. The sounds always began softly, almost subliminally, then gradually increased until they filled the entire hallway. Sometimes I thought I could hear voices underneath the hiss, not words exactly, but the rhythm of conversation, the rise and fall of urgent communication. The dreams started during the 2nd week. A man would appear at the foot of my bed, always the same figure, short, completely bald, with veins that stood out like dark cables beneath pale skin. His eyes held the flat intensity of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He never spoke at first, just stood there until I became aware of his presence, then moved slowly around the bed to sit on the edge of the mattress. The springs would compress under his weight. I could feel the tilt, hear the soft protest of the frame. He'd lean close then, close enough that I could smell something metallic and stale on his breath, and begin speaking in a voice like gravel settling. He'd tell me about the door to the front room, how it needed to be unlocked, how the rooms wanted to breathe together again. His words carried a hypnotic quality, reasonable and insistent. Of course the door should be unlocked. Of course the spaces should connect. It made perfect sense. I'd always wake up agreeing with him. The first time I found the chair I'd wedged under the door handle sitting neatly in the center of the room. I told myself I must have moved it while sleepwalking, though I'd never walked in my sleep before. The second time, I found the door standing open, the chair placed deliberately beside the frame as if someone had carefully moved it aside. After that, I began checking the door obsessively before bed, testing the chair's position, even taking photos with my phone to document how I'd left things. But every morning brought the same result. The chair moved, the door ajar, and no memory of changing either. My father had raised me secular, but my mother had married into Islam, and some cultural inheritance runs deeper than conscious belief. I downloaded Quranic recitations onto my phone. Surah Al-Falaq, Surah An-Nas, the protection verses I remembered hearing as a child. I let them play softly as I slept, Arabic consonants flowing through the darkness like a verbal shield. The static responded immediately. Instead of the usual single source moving along the baseboard, 3 distinct areas of disturbance appeared simultaneously. One positioned itself at the foot of the bed, another at the head, and the third alongside where my chest would be if I were lying down. The shadows converged in these locations, growing denser and more defined until they almost resembled silhouettes pressed against the floor. And for the first time, I heard them clearly. "The back house already belongs to us," they whispered, their voices layering over each other like a conversation between echo and memory. "The back house knows where it belongs." I sat up in bed, heart hammering. But the moment I moved, everything stopped. The shadows vanished. The static cut off mid-hiss, and the hallway returned to normal, if you could call any part of this normal. During the daylight hours, I threw myself into research. The Newark Public Library's local history section became my second home. I pored over property records, old photographs, newspaper archives, anything that might explain the connection between the 2 halves of the duplex. The building dated to 1923, constructed as a single-family home by a developer named Romano, who'd built several similar houses in the neighborhood. It hadn't been converted to a duplex until 1967. The conversion seemed straightforward enough. A new entrance added to the side, some interior walls reconfigured, the long hallway divided by a door to separate the units. But I found a building permit from 1968, filed just a year after the conversion, requesting permission to seal connecting passage between units due to structural concerns. Structural concerns. The phrase nagged at me. What kind of structural concerns would require sealing a passage? I found the answer in a brief newspaper item from March 1968. A resident of the newly converted duplex, the back unit, had complained to the city about unauthorized access between the apartments. The front tenant, he claimed, had been entering his unit at night, moving furniture, leaving doors open. The front tenant denied everything, insisted his connecting door remained locked at all times. The city's solution was to require both doors to be permanently sealed and the passage between them filled with concrete. But looking at the architectural drawings attached to the permit, I realized something troubling. The original connecting passage hadn't run where the door in my front room was located. It had been further back, positioned exactly where I heard the static each night, where the shadows gathered along the baseboard, which meant the door in my room, the one I'd been so carefully barricading, opened into nothing. It had been added during some later renovation, a door to nowhere, serving no purpose except perhaps to confuse future occupants about the building's history. The real passage, the one that had been sealed, lay hidden behind the wall where the shadows danced. That night, I didn't bother with the chair. I left the useless door unlocked and focused my attention on the shared wall itself. The static began punctually at 2:13, but this time I was ready for it. I followed the sound down the hallway, pressing my ear against the wallpaper. The voices were clearer here, muffled by drywall and concrete, but definitely present. Multiple speakers, though I couldn't determine how many. They seemed to be discussing something urgently, their tones rising and falling in a rhythm that suggested argument or negotiation. Occasionally, one voice would separate from the others, always the same gruff, gravelly tone I recognized from my dreams. I found myself understanding fragments, not through translation, but through some deeper recognition, as if the meaning bypassed my conscious mind entirely. They were talking about territory, about boundaries that had been violated. They mentioned the back house repeatedly, and spoke of someone who had crossed over and needed to be returned to his proper place. As I listened, the shadows began appearing at my feet, flowing out from the baseboard like dark liquid. They rose slowly up the wall, taking on more defined shapes. Not quite human, but suggestive of human forms. Arms, heads, torsos, all rendered in that muddy, static gray darkness. One of them turned toward me. It was the man from my dreams, but flattened against the wall like a reflection in disturbed water. His mouth moved, and I heard his voice both through the wall and seeming to come from the shadow itself. "You don't belong in the back house. The back house has its own tenants." I stumbled backward, and in that moment of movement, the entire hallway seemed to shift. The walls stretched impossibly long, the ceiling rose higher, and the passage seemed to continue far beyond where I knew it should end. The shadows multiplied, dozens of them now, all turning in my direction with that flat, hungry attention. "Come to the proper door," the gravelly voice commanded. "Come to where the passage was meant to be." I ran. I made it to the back bedroom and slammed the door, wedging the same chair under the handle that had proven so ineffective before. But even as I did it, I understood the futility. They weren't coming through any door. They were already here, had always been here, separated by nothing more than a thin barrier of plaster and concrete that grew thinner every night. Morning brought no relief, only the exhausted clarity that comes with insomnia and fear. I called my grandparents, intending to explain that I needed to leave early, but found myself unable to articulate what was happening. How do you tell someone that their house is occupied by shadows that speak Arabic and insist you're trespassing in your own bedroom? Instead, I asked about the renovation next door. Had they found anything unusual when they started work? Any structural surprises? My grandmother's voice carried a puzzled note as she explained that they'd discovered an old bricked-up doorway during demolition, positioned right where the kitchen wall met the shared property line. The contractor had been confused. The doorway seemed to lead nowhere, opening into what should have been solid foundation. They'd expanded the opening, thinking it might have been a storage space, but found only a narrow cavity filled with old mortar and debris. A doorway that leads nowhere. After hanging up, I stood in my hallway, measuring distances with my eyes. The kitchen next door would be positioned exactly where my longest hallway ended. If there had once been a passage there, if it had been sealed but not completely filled, then the cavity my grandmother described would run directly alongside where I heard the voices each night, which meant the shadows weren't ghosts or hallucinations. They were tenants, displaced from their proper home by the renovation, pressed up against the thin barrier between the sealed passage and my living space. They'd been compressed into that narrow cavity for decades, and the construction next door had disturbed their prison just enough to let them seep through. But if that were true, it raised an even more disturbing question. What had those tenants been doing in the passage before it was sealed? And why had the original complaint specified that the front tenant was entering the back unit at night, when according to the building records, no one had lived in the front unit yet? That night, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and insane. I would answer their summons. I would go to the proper door, not the useless one in my front room, but the real one, the one that had been sealed behind layers of plaster and time. I found the spot easily enough. The shadows congregated there now every night, pressed against the wall like hands against glass. Using a hammer I'd found in my grandfather's toolbox, I began carefully chipping away at the wallpaper and plaster. The work went faster than it should have. The wall seemed almost eager to open, the old mortar crumbling at the slightest pressure. Within an hour, I'd exposed a section of brick that looked newer than the rest, clearly added during the 1968 ceiling. Behind it, I could hear the voices more clearly than ever. "Almost there," the gravelly voice encouraged. "Almost back where you belong." The first brick came free with a soft grinding sound, revealing a black space beyond. Cool air flowed through the opening, carrying scents of dust and something else, something organic and stale, like the breath of the man in my dreams. I pulled away more bricks, widening the hole until I could see into the passage beyond. It was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to move through sideways, and extended further than my flashlight could illuminate. The floor was concrete, the walls rough brick. At intervals along the length, I could see openings, doorways leading to other rooms, other spaces I couldn't identify. "Come through," the voices whispered. "Come to the back house where you belong." And here's what frightens me most. I wanted to. Every rational part of my mind screamed warnings, but there was something deeply compelling about that dark passage, something that felt like coming home after a long journey. The shadows beckoned, and their invitation felt less like a trap than a reunion. I'd actually started to climb through the opening when I heard something that stopped me cold. The sound of construction equipment starting up next door. Heavy machinery grinding to life. Voices of workers beginning their day. Daylight was coming, and with it, the return of the normal world. I backed away from the hole, suddenly aware of what I'd almost done. The passage stretched into darkness, leading who knows where, connecting to who knows what. The shadows watched from its depths, disappointed but patient. I'm writing this now as the sun rises, the hole in my wall still gaping like a wound. I should seal it back up, should call my grandparents and explain that their house needs serious attention. I should pack my things and leave this place to whatever has been living in its walls. But as I write, I can feel the pull of that dark passage growing stronger. The shadows are quieter during the day, but they're still there, waiting. And I'm beginning to understand that the question isn't whether they're real or imagined, it's whether I'm strong enough to resist the growing certainty that they're right. Maybe I don't belong in the front house after all. Maybe I never did. Maybe the back house, with its narrow passages and patient tenants, has been waiting for me all along. The construction equipment next door has gone quiet. Soon it will be evening again, then night, then 2:13 a.m. And I think this time, I might finally go home. Story 2. The thing about stairs is that they create levels, and levels create hierarchy, and hierarchy creates the perfect conditions for something to study you from above. I learned this 32 years too late, but my mother had planted the seed before I even drew my first breath. She'd admitted it during one of our rare phone calls, her voice carrying that particular brand of guilt that only surfaces when someone confesses to gambling with forces they never bothered to understand. A Ouija board in her Cleveland apartment, she'd said. Just a stupid game with college friends, something to pass the time during those long Ohio winter nights when the snow trapped them indoors and boredom felt like a physical weight. She was 7 months pregnant with me then. What did you ask it? I'd wanted to know, but she'd gone quiet, the way people do when they realize they've already said too much. The line had filled with static, or maybe that sound was something else entirely. Something that had been listening to our conversation through the copper wires that connected our voices across 800 miles of American darkness. Now I sit in my latest rental, another 2-story with another staircase, and I know with the certainty of repeated experience that I have maybe 6 more days of peace. A week, at most. Time enough for whatever follows me to map the creaks in the floorboards, to learn which steps announce a visitor and which ones swallow sound completely. Time enough for it to understand the rhythm of my sleep, the path I take to the bathroom at night, the exact moment when my guard drops lowest. The pattern established itself in Savannah first, though I didn't recognize it as a pattern then. I'd rented a converted loft in the historic district, the kind of place where exposed brick pretended to be charming, and rent prices reflected the owner's confidence that tourists would pay premium prices to sleep where someone might have died romantically in the 1800s. The stairs were narrow and steep, rising from the main room to a bedroom loft that felt more like a ship's cabin than living space. For the first week, nothing. I'd convinced myself that the strange encounters from my childhood were exactly that. Childhood fears amplified by an overactive imagination and too many late-night horror movies. The old woman with skin like tarnished copper, the one who used to appear at the foot of my bed in Cleveland, laughing with her mouth wide but making no sound. Surely that had been dreams bleeding into waking moments, the kind of night terrors that plague kids who spend too much time alone. But then came the 8th night. The footsteps started at exactly 4:30 a.m. I know the time with surgical precision because the digital clock beside my bed cast its green glow directly into my eyes, a luminous accusation that I was awake when I should have been asleep, alert when I should have been vulnerable. The sound began at the top of the stairs, not the creaky top step that announced my own movements during daylight hours, but somewhere just beyond it, as if whatever was moving had materialized in the space between the last step and the landing. Thud. A pause. Then another step, deliberate and measured. Not the quick patter of someone hurrying downstairs, not the careful placement of someone navigating in darkness. This was the walk of someone who knew exactly where they were going and had all the time in the world to get there. Thud. I lay rigid in bed, every muscle locked in place while my mind performed the frantic calculations of someone trying to rationalize the impossible. The building was old. Maybe the wood was settling. Maybe the tenant above me was an insomniac. Maybe the heating system was expanding pipes in a way that mimicked footsteps. Thud. But the footsteps were descending my stairs, the ones that led to my bedroom, the ones that existed in my loft where I lived alone and kept the door locked and had never given anyone else a key. The sound stopped directly outside my bedroom door. In the silence that followed, I could hear my heart hammering against my ribs so loudly that it seemed impossible the thing on the other side of the door couldn't hear it too. Then came the sound that would follow me from city to city, house to house, staircase to staircase. The slow, deliberate turn of a doorknob testing resistance, finding it, and stopping just short of the pressure that would have opened the door. The knob returned to its original position with a click that sounded like a satisfied sigh. I waited until sunrise to investigate, which took approximately 4 hours and felt like 4 years. The stairs showed no signs of intrusion, no footprints in the dust that had accumulated near the edges where my own feet never fell, no scratches on the doorknob, no wear patterns that hadn't been there the day before. Everything exactly as it should be, which somehow made it infinitely worse. The rational mind craves evidence. It wants proof, documentation, something that can be measured and cataloged and explained. When that evidence doesn't exist, the rational mind begins to turn on itself, to question its own reliability with the kind of desperate intensity that usually accompanies a complete breakdown of established reality. I started keeping a journal. Day 9, 4:30 a.m., footsteps again. Counted 13 steps total. Door test lasted approximately 30 seconds. Day 12, same time, same pattern. Tried recording with phone. Battery died at exactly 4:29 a.m. despite being fully charged. Day 15, woke up at 4:25 a.m. expecting it. Footsteps came anyway. It knows I'm listening. The journal entries became increasingly erratic, filled with sketches of staircase layouts and timestamps and detailed descriptions of sounds that no recording device seemed capable of capturing. I drew floor plans obsessively, marking the exact position of each creak, cataloging the acoustic signature of every step. Looking back at those pages now, the handwriting looks like it belongs to someone in the middle of a slow-motion nervous breakdown. Maybe it did. The breakthrough came during a thunderstorm 3 weeks into the pattern. The power had gone out around midnight, leaving me in the kind of complete darkness that makes you understand why humans invented fire in the first place. I'd felt my way to bed using the walls as guides, settled in with a battery-powered radio for company, and tried to convince myself that storms were natural phenomena with perfectly rational explanations. Then, in a lightning flash that turned the world white for exactly 1 second, I saw it. The figure filled the doorway so completely that the frame seemed too small to contain it. Not tall in any human sense, but expansive, as if it occupied more space than the physical dimensions of the room should have allowed. The lightning died, darkness returned, and I was left with the afterimage burned into my retinas. The suggestion of something that bent the rules of architecture simply by existing within them. I moved out the next day. St. Petersburg was supposed to be different. A ranch house, I told myself. No stairs, no levels, no hierarchy for something to establish dominance from above. I'd found a place with a flat roof and a ladder tucked away behind a utility shed. Something I could use to reach the rooftop when I needed to smoke and think and pretend that my problems were the kind that could be solved through nicotine and contemplation. For 3 weeks it worked. No footsteps, no door tests, no figures materializing in lightning flashes. I began to relax into the dangerous comfort of believing I'd solved the problem through simple architectural selection. The thing that followed me needed stairs, I reasoned. It required elevation, levels, the kind of vertical space that allowed it to study my patterns from above. Then I climbed onto the roof for the first time. The night was warm and still, the kind of Florida evening that makes you understand why people retire to places where winter never arrives. I'd lit a cigarette and was enjoying the relative peace of elevation when I felt it. The unmistakable sensation of fingers trailing through my hair. The touch was deliberate, intimate in the way that only uninvited contact can be. Long fingers, dry as old leather, with nails that clicked against each other when they moved. I spun around to find nothing behind me but empty roof and the vast darkness of the Gulf of Mexico stretching toward the horizon. But I'd felt it. The weight, the texture, the undeniable reality of something that shouldn't have been there touching something it had no right to touch. And as I stood there, cigarette burning forgotten between my fingers, I realized that the thing following me had never needed stairs at all. It had simply been learning. In Cleveland, it had appeared at floor level, content to manifest at the foot of my bed where a child's nightmares lived. In Savannah, it had mastered vertical navigation, using the stairs to announce its presence and establish territorial dominance. Now in Florida, it had achieved true three-dimensional mobility, capable of reaching me even when I thought I'd found safety in elevation. The pattern wasn't about architecture, it was about adaptation. I started researching then, spending hours in libraries and diving deep into internet forums where people shared stories that sounded eerily familiar. The language was always the same. Something that follows, learns the house, gets stronger with time. Most of the accounts ended abruptly, either because the poster had moved yet again, or because they'd simply stopped posting altogether. But a few mentioned the Cleveland connection. Ouija boards used in apartments near Case Western University in the early 1990s. Pregnant women asking questions they shouldn't have asked, opening doors they should have left closed. Children born with something already attached, something that grew stronger as they aged and moved and provided it with new architectural challenges to master. I found my mother's building on Google Street View. The apartments had been converted to condos, the facade updated with fresh paint and modern fixtures that couldn't quite hide the underlying geometry of a structure built to house young families and college students. Third floor, second window from the left. That had been her place. That's where she'd sat with her friends on a snow-covered night 33 years ago, asking a board game to reveal the future. What did you ask it? The question I'd never gotten answered suddenly felt less important than another one. What did it tell you? Because I was beginning to suspect that whatever entity my mother had contacted hadn't been interested in predicting the future. It had been interested in creating one, a future where it would have a permanent anchor in the physical world, something it could follow and learn from and grow stronger alongside. Something like a child who would spend his entire life moving from house to house, staircase to staircase, always providing new architectural puzzles for a presence that existed primarily to solve them. The realization should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt almost like relief. For the first time in my adult life, I had an explanation that fit all the available evidence. I wasn't losing my mind. I was being studied, cataloged, mapped like the floors of every house I'd ever lived in. But explanation and solution are two different things entirely. I'm writing this from my latest rental, a split level in Charleston with stairs that connect the main floor to a basement workshop. The moving truck left yesterday. I've unpacked the essentials, arranged the furniture, established the routines that will become familiar over the next week. Tomorrow is day 7. I've been thinking about that Ouija board session, about the questions my mother and her friends might have asked, and the answers they might have received. Did they ask about their futures, their careers, the children they would have? Or did something else initiate contact, something that had been waiting for exactly the right combination of curiosity and pregnancy and architectural access to begin a relationship that would span decades? The basement stairs creak differently than the ones in Savannah or the ladder in St. Petersburg. Each step has its own acoustic signature, its own warning system for anyone who might be listening. I've been mapping them obsessively, the way I always do, creating detailed charts of sound and movement and opportunity. But this time I think I'm not the only one taking notes. Tonight, I'll sleep in the upper level and wait for 4:30 a.m. to arrive. I'll listen for footsteps ascending from the basement, testing each stair with the patience of something that has all the time in the world to learn the layout of its newest temporary home. And tomorrow, I'll begin planning my next move, because that's what I do. I move, and it follows, and together we explore the infinite variations of American residential architecture, one staircase at a time. The only question now is whether I'm the researcher or the subject, whether I'm mapping its behavior or it's mapping mine, whether the child born to a woman who played with forces beyond her understanding is destined to spend his entire life climbing stairs for something that's always 3 steps ahead or 3 steps behind, but never quite on the same level. The sound starts tonight. It always does, right on schedule. I'll be listening. Story 3. The headache started in October, drilling behind my eyes like carpenter ants boring through rotted wood. My doctor prescribed walks, fresh air, anything to get me out of the apartment where I'd been hibernating since the layoffs. That's how I found myself on those old logging roads outside Rangeley, where the skeletal remains of Maine's timber industry stretched into the wilderness like arthritic fingers. The first trail I followed had been carved decades ago, wide enough for trucks to haul out giant pines that now existed only as stumps scattered through the undergrowth. Grass and wildflowers had reclaimed the center, but tire ruts still channeled rainwater into muddy streams that disappeared into the forest. Walking those paths felt like traveling through a graveyard of industry, where nature was slowly digesting the bones of human ambition. I'd been hiking for maybe 2 hours when I heard the voices. They drifted through the trees from somewhere ahead, muffled by distance and foliage. 3 distinct tones, conversational but indistinct, like radio chatter from another room. The sound drew me forward until I reached a clearing where the old logging road split around a natural meadow. A small stream ran along the eastern edge, spanned by a wooden bridge that looked newer than everything else in this forgotten place. On the far side of the bridge, 3 people were working in the afternoon sun. 2 men and a woman, all appearing to be in their 40s or 50s, though something about them made it difficult to judge their ages precisely. Their clothes looked like they'd been pulled from a camping catalog from 20 years ago. Faded flannel shirts, canvas pants with permanent creases, hiking boots that had seen better decades. But it wasn't just their outdated gear that caught my attention. Their hair looked untouched by time, each strand in place as if they'd just stepped out of a barber shop, despite spending what appeared to be hours working in the clearing. The woman noticed me first. She straightened from where she'd been arranging branches and called out across the water. "We could use another pair of hands if you're not in a hurry." Her voice carried clearly across the stream, warm and inviting. The 2 men looked up from their work. They seemed to be constructing some kind of windbreak using fallen logs and gathered branches. One of them, a tall man with graying temples, waved me over. "Building a shelter before the weather turns," he explained as I approached the bridge. "This clearing catches all the wind coming down from the mountains." I hesitated at the bridge's edge. The structure looked solid enough, but something made me reluctant to cross. Instead, I called back, "What kind of shelter?" "Just a windbreak," the woman replied. "Nothing fancy. We come out here pretty regularly. Thought it would be nice to have a spot to rest." The third man, shorter and stockier than the others, gestured toward the pile of materials they'd gathered. "Won't take long with an extra set of hands." There was something compelling about their invitation, a warmth that cut through the growing chill of the late afternoon. But my feet remained planted on my side of the stream. "I should probably head back before dark," I said, though I wasn't sure why. "Maybe tomorrow." The woman smiled. "We'll be here." I returned the next day, drawn by curiosity and the strange comfort I'd felt in their presence. They were already at work when I arrived, as if they'd never left. This time they'd made significant progress on their shelter, a neat arrangement of logs and branches that would indeed provide excellent protection from the northern wind. Again, they invited me to cross the bridge and help, and again I found myself declining, though I couldn't articulate why. Instead, I spent an hour talking with them from my side of the stream. They asked about my hiking, seemed genuinely interested in my observations about the abandoned logging roads. They shared stories about the area's history, details about the timber operations that had once thrived here. The tall man mentioned camps that had housed hundreds of workers during the peak logging years. The woman described the sound of saws and machinery that had once echoed through these valleys. The shorter man talked about the animals that had returned as the forest reclaimed the cleared land. Their knowledge seemed encyclopedic, as if they'd witnessed the industry's rise and fall firsthand. But when I asked direct questions, where they lived, how long they'd been coming to this spot, What their names were, their answers became vague, deflected with smiles and subject changes. Not evasive exactly, but imprecise in a way that left me feeling like I'd learned nothing substantial about them, despite our lengthy conversations. This became our routine over the following weeks. I would hike out to the clearing in the afternoons, find them working on various improvements to their shelter, or simply sitting in the sun, and we would talk across the narrow stream. They never crossed to my side, and I never crossed to theirs, though neither side ever explicitly acknowledged this invisible boundary. The conversations were always pleasant, sometimes enlightening, but afterwards I could never quite remember the specifics of what we'd discussed. I'd walk home with a warm feeling of having made new friends, but when I tried to recall actual quotes or specific topics, my memory felt frustratingly fuzzy, like trying to remember details from a dream. The shelter grew more elaborate with each visit. What had started as a simple windbreak evolved into something resembling a three-walled cabin, complete with a roof of carefully woven branches. They'd even constructed a table from a split log, supported by expertly fitted posts that showed real craftsmanship. The work progressed faster than seemed possible for three people working with basic tools, but I attributed this to their obvious experience and skill. By November, the shelter had become a cozy retreat that looked like it could withstand serious weather. The three had furnished it with split log benches, and had even begun work on what appeared to be a stone fire ring. When I commented on their impressive progress, they seemed pleased but not particularly proud, as if building such structures was simply what people did in places like this. Then came the night of the big storm. I'd been planning to visit the clearing that day, but heavy rain began falling before dawn and continued through the evening. The weather reports called it a nor'easter, with winds gusting over 50 miles per hour and several inches of rain expected. From my apartment window, I could see trees bending almost horizontally in the wind, and the thought of my three friends weathering the storm in their shelter made me anxious. I worried about them all night. Had they sought shelter elsewhere? Or were they riding out the storm in their handmade refuge? The wind howled until nearly sunrise, rattling windows and sending branches crashing into the yard. When dawn finally came, the world outside looked rearranged, littered with debris and standing water. I drove out to the trailhead as soon as the roads were clear, hiking quickly to the familiar clearing. What I found there defied explanation. The shelter was still standing, but it looked wrong. The wood appeared weathered and gray, as if it had been exposed to decades of seasonal cycles. The carefully woven roof had partially collapsed, with sections rotted through and hanging in tatters. The log table they'd been so proud of had split down the middle, its surfaces black with what looked like years of accumulated mold and moss. Most disturbing were the ropes. Throughout the construction, I'd noticed them using various kinds of cordage to secure their building materials. Now those same ropes appeared to have fossilized into the wood itself, creating permanent grooves and indentations that looked like they'd been carved by time rather than worn by weather. But the three people were nowhere to be seen. I called across the water, thinking they might be taking shelter elsewhere in the clearing. My voice echoed strangely in the post-storm air, seeming to carry farther than it should before being absorbed by the dripping forest. No response came. For the first time since I'd discovered this place, I crossed the bridge. The wooden planks felt solid beneath my feet, but something about crossing that threshold made my skin crawl. It was as if I were violating some unspoken agreement, entering a space where I didn't belong. The feeling grew stronger as I approached the deteriorated shelter. Up close, the decay was even more pronounced. What had been fresh-cut wood just yesterday now crumbled at my touch. The stone fire ring they'd been constructing was overgrown with lichen and moss, as if it had been abandoned for years. Even the ground around the shelter looked different, compacted and worn in patterns that suggested long habitation, not the temporary camping spot I'd observed being created. I searched the entire clearing but found no trace of my three companions, no personal belongings, no tools, no indication that anyone had been there recently. It was as if they'd simply vanished, leaving behind only their impossible ruins. Confused and increasingly disturbed, I hiked back to my car and drove directly to the Rangeley Forest Service Station. The ranger on duty was a middle-aged woman with weathered hands and patient eyes, who listened politely as I described the clearing, the bridge, and the three people I'd been visiting. She pulled out a detailed topographical map and asked me to show her the location. I traced my route along the old logging roads, but when I reached the area where the clearing should have been, she frowned. "There's no bridge marked here," she said, tapping the map with her finger. "Stream runs through this section, but I don't recall any crossing points along this stretch." I insisted I'd been visiting the spot for weeks, describing the clearing and the shelter in detail. She listened thoughtfully, then asked me to describe the 3 people I'd been meeting there. When I finished, she shook her head slowly. "I've been working this district for 15 years, she said. "I know most of the regular hikers and campers in the area. Your description doesn't match anyone I recognize." She suggested I might have gotten turned around on the old logging roads, which were notoriously confusing and poorly marked. Many of them had been abandoned for so long that they'd partially grown over, creating false trails that led nowhere. "It would be easy," she explained, "to think you were following familiar routes when you were actually discovering new territory each time. But I knew what I'd seen." I drove back to the trailhead that same afternoon, determined to prove that the clearing, the bridge, and the shelter existed exactly as I remembered them. I found the clearing without difficulty. The bridge was still there, spanning the small stream just as it had every day for the past month. But something had changed on the far side. The ruined shelter stood exactly where I'd left it that morning, still weathered and decayed beyond belief. But now I could see additional details that hadn't been visible before. Scattered throughout the structure were small pieces of bright fabric, neon yellow and orange strips that fluttered in the afternoon breeze like prayer flags or survey markers. The strips appeared to be made of some synthetic material, possibly surveyor's tape or trail markers. They were tied to various points throughout the ruins, creating an incongruous splash of modern color against the ancient-looking decay. Some fluttered from the collapsed roof, others were wrapped around the fossilized rope impressions in the logs, and a few marked spots on the ground where I was certain furniture had once stood. I crossed the bridge again, fighting the same uncomfortable sensation I'd experienced that morning. The neon markers seemed to multiply as I got closer, until I realized they weren't just attached to the structure, but were scattered throughout the surrounding forest as well, tied to branches and stumps in patterns that might have been random or might have been some kind of code. As I walked among the ruins, trying to understand what I was seeing, the wind shifted and began blowing from the north. That's when I heard the voices, faint but unmistakable, 3 people talking somewhere in the distance, the same conversational tones I'd grown accustomed to over the past weeks, though the words remained indistinct. I followed the sound deeper into the clearing, but it seemed to move with the wind, always just ahead of me, always just out of range. I called out to them, using the same friendly greeting I'd employed during our daily conversations. My voice seemed to hang in the air without response, as if the forest were absorbing the sound before it could travel. The distant voices continued their incomprehensible discussion, completely unaware of or uninterested in my presence. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees. The neon strips became more visible in the dimming light, glowing like radioactive markers against the darkening woods. Some appeared to be moving slightly, though there was no wind strong enough to explain their motion. That's when I noticed the footprints. The ground around the ruined shelter was soft from the previous night's rain, and clearly visible in the mud were 3 sets of boot prints. They circled the structure, approached and retreated from various points, and led off into the forest in the direction from which the voices seemed to be coming. But the prints looked wrong. Too deep for the soft ground, and filled with water that reflected the sky like permanent puddles. Around the edges of each print, the mud had dried and cracked as if the impressions had been there for much longer than a single day. I followed the tracks deeper into the woods, though something told me this was a mistake. The voices grew neither louder nor softer as I pursued them, maintaining their constant, incomprehensible babble somewhere just ahead. The neon strips became more frequent among the trees, creating an increasingly dense network of markers that seemed to pulse and shift in my peripheral vision. The forest around me looked different from any section I'd explored during my weeks of hiking. The trees were taller and more densely packed, their canopy so thick that very little sunlight reached the ground, even though it had been bright in the clearing just minutes before. The air felt heavier, charged with an electricity that made my skin tingle and my hair stand on end. I stopped following the footprints when I realized I could no longer see the clearing behind me. The forest had closed in from all directions, and every path between the trees looked identical. The voices continued their distant conversation, but they now seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once, as if echoing off invisible walls. Panic began to build in my chest as I tried to retrace my steps. The neon markers that had seemed like helpful guideposts now appeared menacing, their bright colors too vivid against the perpetual twilight of the deep woods. They formed patterns that hurt to look at directly, geometric arrangements that suggested meaning just beyond comprehension. I ran, crashing through underbrush and dodging between trees, following what I hoped was the direction back to the clearing. Branches caught at my clothes and scratched my face, but I kept running until I stumbled out of the tree line and found myself back at the ruined shelter. The bridge was still there, spanning the stream to the normal world beyond. I crossed it quickly, not looking back until I reached my original side of the water. When I finally turned around, the clearing looked exactly as it had when I'd first discovered it. Empty, peaceful, with no sign of the ruins or the neon markers or anything else that had terrified me moments before. On the far side of the stream, 3 people were sitting around a perfectly constructed shelter, their outdated clothes neat and clean, their impossible hair unmoved by wind or exertion. They waved as if I'd just arrived for my daily visit, their smiles warm and welcoming across the water. The woman called out her familiar greeting, inviting me to cross the bridge and join them in their work. The tall man gestured toward their shelter with obvious pride, as if showing it off for the first time. The shorter man patted the ground beside their split log table, indicating where I could sit and rest. I backed away from the bridge, my heart hammering against my ribs. None of them seemed to notice my distress or confusion. They continued their welcoming gestures, their eternal invitation to cross the water and enter their domain. I turned and ran back along the logging road, not stopping until I reached my car. That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't returned to the clearing, though I drive past the trailhead every few days and feel an almost irresistible urge to park and walk back down that familiar path. The headaches that originally drove me to these woods have returned with doubled intensity, boring behind my eyes like something trying to burrow its way out. Some nights, when the wind blows from the north, I hear voices outside my apartment window. 3 people having a quiet conversation just beyond the range of understanding, their words as familiar and incomprehensible as they were across that stream. When I look outside, I see strips of neon fabric tied to the branches of the oak tree in my yard, fluttering like signals in a code I'm not meant to understand. I've started researching the history of the logging operations in that area, searching through old maps and forestry records for any mention of settlements or camps near the site I discovered. The archives contain detailed documentation of every major logging operation from the late 1800s through the 1950s, but none of them match the location of my clearing. More disturbing are the personnel records I've found. Scattered throughout decades of employment documents are the names of workers who simply disappeared from the camps, not quit, not transferred, not recorded as injured or deceased, but simply vanished from the paperwork as if they'd never existed. The descriptions in their employment files matched the 3 people I met across the stream with uncomfortable accuracy. Yesterday I found a photograph in the Historical Society's collection that made my blood run cold. Taken in 1947, it shows a group of timber workers standing beside a partially constructed shelter in a clearing that looks exactly like the one I discovered. 3 figures in the foreground, 2 men and a woman, are clearly identifiable as my 3 companions, unchanged by the decades between that photograph and our meetings last month. The caption identifies the location as Camp 7 Northern Division, but according to every other document in the collection, no such camp ever existed. The photograph itself shows signs of age, faded colors, water stains, the characteristic deterioration of mid-century film stock. But the 3 faces in the foreground are as sharp and clear as if they'd been photographed yesterday. I've been carrying that photograph with me for days, studying those familiar faces and trying to understand what it means. Are they ghosts trapped in that clearing, endlessly building their shelter while decades pass unnoticed? Are they some kind of temporal anomaly, existing in a pocket of time that doesn't align with the rest of the world? Or am I losing my mind, creating elaborate fantasies to explain experiences that exist only in my deteriorating psyche? The neon strips outside my window have multiplied. They now cover most of the oak tree and have begun appearing on other vegetation in the area. My neighbors don't seem to notice them, going about their daily routines as if nothing has changed. When I pointed them out to the landlord, he looked directly at the tree and told me it appeared perfectly normal. The voices have gotten louder. Last night they woke me from a sound sleep, 3 familiar tones discussing something urgent in their incomprehensible language. I looked outside and saw them standing beneath the oak tree, still wearing their outdated hiking clothes, their impossibly perfect hair undisturbed by the November wind. They looked up at my window and waved, the same welcoming gesture they'd used to invite me across the stream. When I blinked, they were gone, but the neon markers fluttered more vigorously in the branches, pulsing with a rhythm that might have been Morse code or might have been a heartbeat. I think they're trying to show me something. I think the clearing exists in more places than just that abandoned logging road, that the bridge can be crossed from multiple directions depending on when and how you approach it. The photograph suggests they've been building their shelter for over 70 years, adding to it and improving it while time flows differently around them. Maybe they're not trapped there. Maybe they're waiting. The invitation still stands, spoken clearly across whatever distance separates their domain from mine. They have a place at their table, a role in their endless construction project, a spot in their timeless clearing where the calendar follows rules I don't understand. All I have to do is cross the bridge. The headaches are getting worse. My doctor wants to run more tests, but I know what she'll find. The same nothing that explains everything wrong with my life since the layoffs. The same empty results that sent me walking in the woods in the first place. Tomorrow I'm going back to the clearing. Not to visit from across the stream like before, but to finish what I apparently started weeks ago. The 3 are still there, still working on their impossible shelter, still waiting for me to accept their invitation and help them complete whatever it is they're building. Maybe when I cross that bridge, the headaches will stop. Maybe time will slow to their rhythm instead of the frantic pace that drove me to those woods in the first place. Maybe I'll finally understand what they're trying to tell me with their neon signals and fossilized ropes and decades-long construction project. Or maybe I'll discover that sanity is just another kind of calendar, and some places follow different rules about what's real and what's possible. Either way, I won't be coming back to this side of the stream. The invitation has been extended, and I'm finally ready to accept it. The clearing is calling, and I can hear my name in the voices that drift through the November wind. Time to cross the bridge. Story 4. The blood had dried to a rust-colored stain by morning. The paper curled at its edges where my trembling fingers had pressed too hard. I should have thrown it away immediately, should have laughed at my own desperation and chalked it up to too much whiskey and too little sleep. Instead, I left it there on the kitchen table, that makeshift contract written in ballpoint pen at 3 in the morning when the bills were stacked higher than my pride, and the eviction notice felt like a death sentence. 30 years of prosperity now for 30 years of service after death. The words looked different in daylight, childish somehow, like something scrawled during a fever dream. But the droplet of blood at the center, my blood, drawn with a kitchen knife across my thumb, remained dark and definitive. A signature in the most primitive currency known to man, Columbus had been unforgiving that winter. The consulting work dried up faster than I could find new clients, and the savings account that had once felt substantial now mocked me with its dwindling double digits. My apartment, a cramped one-bedroom in the brewery district, had become both sanctuary and prison. The radiator clanged like an angry ghost, and the thin walls let in every argument, every footstep, every reminder that life continued for everyone else while mine ground to a halt. That's when I made the deal. Not with any particular entity. I wasn't religious enough for the devil, wasn't spiritual enough for demons, just with whatever might be listening in the spaces between desperation and surrender. The kind of bargain that emerges when rational thought dissolves into pure need. I woke up that first morning feeling foolish. The paper sat there like evidence of temporary insanity, and I almost crumpled it up a dozen times, Instead, I made coffee and tried to forget the strange sensation that had accompanied my bizarre ritual. The feeling that something had shifted in the air, that the shadows in the corner had leaned forward to listen. The hand marks appeared 3 days later. I discovered them when I returned from a particularly humiliating job interview, the kind where they smile politely while their eyes calculate exactly how desperate you are. The kitchen table bore 2 distinct impressions pressed into the wood grain, as if someone had placed their palms flat against the surface and pushed down hard. The marks were small, elongated, with 4 distinct finger impressions ending in what looked like nail gouges. They faced the direction of my bedroom. Standing there in my cramped kitchen, staring at those impossible marks, I felt the first flutter of something that wasn't quite fear yet. More like the moment before recognition, when the mind scrambles to process something it doesn't want to accept. The wood was old, I told myself. The radiator heat caused expansion and contraction. There had to be a logical explanation. But logic felt thin and insubstantial compared to the weight of those marks, the deliberate positioning, the way they seemed to watch me even when I turned my back. The sounds started that same night. At first I attributed them to the building's settling bones, the way old structures groan and whisper in the darkness. But these sounds had a different quality, solid, purposeful, coming from directly above my bed. Footsteps, maybe, except they followed a pattern too regular to be human movement. Step, pause, always at the same intervals, always tracing the same path across my ceiling. I pressed my ear to the floor above during the day when Mrs. Chen was at work. The apartment felt empty, smelled of jasmine tea and loneliness. No footprints in the dust, no signs of disturbance. Yet every night the sounds resumed their measured patrol. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie there listening to that steady rhythm overhead, synchronized with the kitchen clock's ticking like some hellish metronome. The sounds would continue until just before dawn, then stop so abruptly that the silence felt aggressive. The scratch marks appeared on a Tuesday. I woke with my shoulder burning, 2 parallel lines drawn across my skin like railroad tracks. The scratches were shallow but precise, starting at the base of my neck and trailing down toward my collarbone. In the bathroom mirror, they looked like claw marks, or fingernails drawn across fabric, except the fabric had been my sleeping skin. I examined my sheets, looking for loose threads or sharp edges that might explain the marks. Found nothing. The scratches burned throughout the day, a constant reminder that something had touched me while I slept, something with intentions I couldn't fathom. That afternoon, the call came. Harrison Industries wanted to hire me for a 6-month contract worth more than I'd made in the previous 2 years. The woman on the phone spoke with the kind of crisp efficiency that accompanies serious money, and she seemed oddly uninterested in my qualifications. When I asked how they'd gotten my name, she paused just long enough to make the question feel inappropriate. "You came highly recommended," she said, and hung up before I could ask by whom. The contract arrived by messenger that same evening. 6 months of consulting work, payment up front, terms so favorable they seemed almost absurd. I signed it at my kitchen table, directly over the bloodstain that had started everything, and tried to ignore the way my hand trembled as I wrote my name. That night, the sounds changed. Instead of footsteps, I heard something that resembled applause, a slow rhythmic clapping that matched my heartbeat. When I sat up in bed, the sound stopped immediately, as if whatever was making it had been waiting for my attention. In the morning, I found my alarm clock had been turned to face the wall, its green digits glowing uselessly against plaster. The money hit my account the next day, followed immediately by a strange realization. I no longer felt grateful. The financial relief I'd expected was there, but underneath it ran something else. A creeping awareness that I was being managed, guided, controlled. The prosperity I'd bargained for was arriving exactly as promised, but it felt less like salvation and more like the closing of a carefully orchestrated trap. Days began to blur together in ways that felt unnatural. I'd sit down to work and find hours had passed without my awareness, my computer screen filled with completed tasks I couldn't remember performing. My grocery shopping became eerily efficient. I'd walk the aisles with purpose, selecting items I didn't recall putting on my list, returning home with exactly what I needed and nothing more. The entity, because I could no longer pretend it was anything else, wasn't interested in my wealth or success. Those were just tools, means to an end I was only beginning to understand. What it wanted was something far more intimate. My patterns, my rhythms, my autonomy. It was studying me, learning my habits with the methodical patience of a scientist cataloging a specimen. My morning routine became rigid without my conscious decision. Coffee at exactly 7:15, shower at 7:30, dressed and out the door by 8 or any deviation resulted in a gnawing anxiety that felt artificially implanted, as if my nervous system had been rewired to punish independence. I told myself I was simply becoming more organized, more efficient, but the truth felt darker and more invasive. The sounds from above grew more complex, evolving into what sounded like construction work. Drilling, hammering, the scrape of furniture being moved. When I finally worked up the courage to knock on Mrs. Chen's door, she looked at me with genuine confusion. Sounds? What sounds? My apartment's been quiet as a tomb. Her choice of words sent ice through my veins, but her bewilderment seemed genuine. Either she was lying, or the sounds existed solely for my benefit. A private concert of psychological warfare designed to keep me off balance and compliant. Sleep became a battleground. I'd lie awake listening to my apartment breathe around me, every creak and settle amplified into potential threat. The scratches appeared more frequently now, always in pairs, always while I slept. I started going to bed fully clothed, but it made no difference. Whatever was marking me could reach through fabric as easily as skin. My work performance, meanwhile, became unnaturally flawless. Projects completed themselves ahead of schedule. Solutions arrived in my mind fully formed. Clients praised my insights with an enthusiasm that felt rehearsed. The success I'd bargained for was being delivered with mechanical precision, but it came at the cost of feeling like myself. I was becoming a puppet whose strings were invisible, but undeniably real. The realization hit me during a client meeting when I heard myself speaking words I hadn't planned, making promises I didn't remember formulating. My voice sounded like my voice. My ideas felt like my ideas. But there was a subtle disconnection, as if I was watching myself perform from behind glass. The client nodded and smiled, completely satisfied with whatever I was saying, but I felt like a fraud wearing my own skin. That evening I tried to break the pattern. Instead of my usual 7:15 coffee, I waited until 8 The anxiety that followed was immediate and overwhelming. A crushing sense of wrongness that made my hands shake and my vision blur. I managed to hold out for 20 minutes before stumbling to the kitchen and brewing that cup of coffee, the relief flooding through me like a drug hitting my bloodstream. I was being trained, I realized, conditioned like one of those lab rats pressing livers for rewards. Except my reward was the absence of unbearable anxiety. My free will was being eroded through a systematic program of psychological manipulation, my independence traded away one small compromise at a time. The sounds from above stopped abruptly on a Thursday night, replaced by something worse. Silence so complete it felt aggressive. I lay in bed straining to hear the familiar rhythm of footsteps, the strange comfort of knowing my tormentor was present and accountable. Instead, there was nothing. A void so profound it made me question whether the sounds had ever existed at all. But the silence wasn't empty. It was full of potential, pregnant with the promise of something far worse than mysterious footsteps and scratch marks. It was the silence of held breath, of predators waiting for prey to make a mistake. I started leaving the apartment lights on at night, but that only made the shadows seem more deliberate, more purposeful. They gathered in corners and doorways like living things, shifting just enough to catch my peripheral vision, but never moving when I looked directly. My reflection in the bathroom mirror began to feel unreliable. Sometimes I thought I saw movement behind me when I knew I was alone. Sometimes my own eyes looked unfamiliar, calculating. The hand marks on the table multiplied. Not more sets, but deeper impressions, as if whatever was making them was pressing harder each time, claiming ownership through repetition. I tried sanding them away, but they returned within hours, darker and more defined than before. The wood around them began to warp and discolor. as if something caustic was seeping up from below. My sleep schedule became militarily precise without any conscious effort on my part. Bed at exactly 11 now. Lights out at 11:15. Alarm at 6:30. Any attempt to deviate triggered that same crushing anxiety, that feeling of cosmic wrongness that made my bones ache. I was becoming a clock. My human variability systematically eliminated in favor of mechanical predictability. The prosperity continued to flow like water from a poisoned well. More contracts, more money, more success than I'd ever dreamed possible. But each victory felt hollow, scripted, as if I was reading lines in a play written by someone else. My bank account swelled while my sense of self withered, prosperity and autonomy existing in perfect inverse proportion. I began to suspect that the 30 years had already begun, not after death, as I'd written in my desperate contract, but now, in this life that no longer felt entirely my own. The entity, whatever it was, had found a more elegant solution than waiting for my natural demise. Why claim my service in some hypothetical afterlife when it could harvest my compliance in the here and now? The scratch marks evolved into something more complex, patterns that looked almost like writing, symbols carved into my skin while I slept. I photographed them, tried to research their meaning, but they faded by evening as if my body was rejecting the evidence. Only the memory remained, along with the growing certainty that I was being inscribed with instructions I couldn't read. My apartment began to feel like a terrarium, a controlled environment where I was both specimen and observer. The temperature remained constant regardless of weather outside. The lighting seemed to adjust itself to optimal levels without my touching the switches. Even the sounds from neighboring units faded to a barely audible hum. I was being isolated, insulated, preserved in conditions ideal for whatever experiment was being conducted on my consciousness. The final revelation came on a night when insomnia had driven me to the kitchen at exactly 3 a.m., the same time I'd made my original bargain. I sat at the table, staring at the bloodstain that had started everything, when I noticed something that stopped my heart mid-beat. The stain was fresh, dark red, wet, identical to how it had looked that first night. But I hadn't cut myself, hadn't performed any ritual. I touched it with one finger and came away with warm blood that shouldn't have existed. That's when I understood. The deal wasn't something I had made. It was something I was going to make, something I was destined to make, caught in a loop that had no beginning and no end. The entity hadn't responded to my desperate bargain. It had created the circumstances that made the bargain inevitable. I looked up at the ceiling, where the sounds had returned with gentle, almost apologetic rhythm, and realized that my 30 years of service had been ongoing for longer than I could remember. The prosperity, the control, the gradual erosion of my autonomy, all of it was part of a design so elegant and comprehensive that resistance was impossible because resistance had never been an option. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, matching the rhythm from above, and I understood that time itself had become my cage. Every second scheduled, every moment accounted for, every choice an illusion wrapped around an inevitability I could no longer see the edges of. I sit here now, writing this account at exactly 3 a.m., the blood still wet on the paper, knowing that somewhere in the space between my thoughts and my actions, something else is writing too. Something that wants not my wealth or my life, but my time, every precious, irreplaceable second of it, measured out in heartbeats and scratches and the endless, patient rhythm of footsteps overhead. The deal is complete. It always was. The only question remaining is whether this knowledge is the beginning of my awakening or simply the next phase of my conditioning, another layer of awareness, granted to make the cage more comfortable. Outside, Columbus sleeps under a canopy of winter stars, but inside my apartment, time moves to a different rhythm entirely, a rhythm I no longer control, if I ever did. The prosperity flows like clockwork. The sounds keep their measured beat, and somewhere in the space between my thoughts and the page, something that isn't quite me continues to write our story. The blood is still warm. It's always warm. And in 30 years, or 30 minutes, or 30 seconds, I'll pick up the knife again and make the same deal I've been making forever, in a loop so perfect and seamless that the word choice has lost all meaning. The clock strikes 3:01, and somewhere above me, something that sounds almost like applause echoes through the ceiling, celebrating another successful negotiation in a contract written in time itself. Story 5. Cabin pressure always feels wrong before takeoff. That familiar squeeze behind my temples, the way my ears pop and protest against the artificial atmosphere. I've been flying this route, LAX to JFK, for 3 years now, and still my palms sweat against the armrests as the engines wind up to that mechanical scream that promises to hurl 37,000 pounds of metal into the sky. Tonight's red-eye is particularly brutal. The melatonina dissolves bitter under my tongue while passengers shuffle past in the blue dark cabin, their faces ghostly in the overhead reading lights. I close my eyes and try to focus on what my therapist calls grounding techniques, the texture of the seat fabric, the recycled air moving through the vents, the distant rumble of cargo being loaded below. But sleep, when it comes, brings no peace. In the dream, the oxygen masks drop like yellow fruit from a poison tree. They dangle and sway with the aircraft's movement, creating shadows that writhe across the ceiling. The other passengers seem unaware, continuing their conversations about quarterly reports and weekend plans while rubber tubes brush against their shoulders like curious snakes. That's when she appears. The flight attendant moves down the aisle with practiced grace, her smile serene and knowing. Her uniform is crisp, navy blue with golden wings pinned above her heart, but something about her face tugs at a memory I can't quite place. She's older, maybe 60, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and eyes that seem to hold decades of secrets. She stops beside my seat, and I notice her feet, bare beneath the uniform hem, pale and slender against the industrial carpet. The detail strikes me as odd, even in the logic of dreams, but before I can question it, her cool fingers close over mine. "The pilot corrects," she says, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Always corrects. Her touch is gentle but firm, and I realize she knows something about me that I don't know about myself. In the way of dreams, this feels both impossible and inevitable. The aircraft lurches, a pocket of rough air that should send my heart racing. But her presence steadies me like an anchor. I wake as the plane begins its descent into New York, the dream clinging to my consciousness like smoke. The sensation of those fingers lingers on the back of my hand. Not warm exactly, but not entirely absent either. I flex my fingers and try to shake off the unease, but something about the dream feels more solid than dreams should. The call to my mother happens almost without conscious decision. Standing in the terminal at JFK, surrounded by the early morning chaos of arriving passengers, I dial her number and wait through 3 rings before her familiar voice answers. I tell her about the dream, about the flight attendant who seemed so real, so present. I describe the woman's face, her uniform, the way she moved through the cabin like she'd been doing it for decades. But it's the detail about her bare feet that seems to catch my mother's attention, creating a silence so profound I wonder if the call has dropped. When she finally speaks, her voice carries a tremor I've never heard before. "She was buried that way," she says. "It was our family's custom back then. We believed bare feet helped the soul find its way home." The explanation should comfort me, should provide some rational framework for why my subconscious conjured such a specific detail. Instead, it opens something in my mind like a door I didn't know existed. My great aunt, my grandmother's younger sister, died of meningitis in 1973, 3 years before I was born. I've seen exactly 2 photographs of her, one as a young woman in a sundress, another in what must have been an airline uniform from the early 70s. She worked for Trans World Airlines, my mother explains, filling in details I never knew I needed. Flew domestic routes for nearly 20 years before she got sick. Always said the sky was where she belonged. The conversation ends with promises to visit soon, to look through more old photographs, but I carry her words with me like a weight in my chest. Over the following weeks, I find myself researching things I never cared about before. Airline employment records from the 70s, uniform designs, crew protocols for flights between Los Angeles and New York. What I discover shouldn't surprise me, but somehow does. My great-aunt flew this exact route dozens of times. LAX to JFK was one of TWA's flagship runs in those days. and the employee records I managed to access through a contact in the industry show her name on manifests stretching back to 1968. The next time I fly, 3 weeks later, I pay attention to details I'd previously ignored. The way the cabin lighting creates pools of shadow between the seats, how the air circulation system produces sounds that almost resemble whispered conversations, the particular quality of silence that descends when most passengers have fallen asleep, leaving only the aircraft's mechanical heartbeat and the occasional rustle of someone shifting in their seat. This time, there's no dream. But during a patch of moderate turbulence over Colorado, I feel it again. That gentle pressure on the back of my right hand, fingers that seem to count along with each bump and jolt, as if measuring the aircraft's corrections against some invisible standard. The sensation lasts perhaps 30 seconds, but it leaves me wide awake for the remainder of the flight, staring at the overhead compartments and wondering what else might be hiding in the spaces between what I can see and what I can prove. Flight after flight, the pattern establishes itself. Not every time, never predictable enough for that, but often enough that I begin to anticipate it. The touch always comes during turbulence, always on the same hand, always with that quality of gentle counting that suggests someone keeping careful track of something I can't understand. I start documenting the occurrences. Flight numbers, times, weather conditions, seat assignments. The data reveals no obvious pattern, except that it never happens on smooth flights. Only when the air gets rough, when the aircraft bucks and shudders through invisible obstacles, do I feel those fingers measuring each correction. My therapist suggests stress manifestation, a physical response to anxiety that my mind interprets as external touch. The explanation is reasonable, grounded in established psychology, but it doesn't account for the specificity of the sensation or the fact that it only occurs at altitude. On a particularly turbulent flight in late autumn, somewhere over Kansas, the touch lingers longer than usual. Instead of the brief counting pressure I've grown accustomed to, the fingers remain steady on my hand for nearly 2 minutes while the aircraft climbs and descends through layers of unstable air. In that extended contact, I swear I can feel a pulse, not my own, which is hammering against my ribs, but something slower, steadier, like a heartbeat measured against eternity. When I turn to look at the seat beside me, expecting to find nothing as always, there's a woman there. Not clearly visible, not solid enough to be considered real, but present in the way that peripheral vision sometimes captures movement that direct sight cannot confirm. She wears what might be a uniform, dark fabric with lighter accents, and her hair is pulled back in a style that seems from another decade. Most unsettling of all, her feet rest against the cabin floor without shoes, pale against the industrial carpet. I blink, and she's gone. But the pressure on my hand remains until the turbulence passes and the aircraft settles into smooth air above the weather. The flight attendant, the real one, a tired-looking man in his 40s, stops by during drink service and asks if I'm feeling all right. I must look as shaken as I feel, because he offers me an extra packet of peanuts and suggests I might want to speak with the captain if I'm concerned about the aircraft's handling. But what would I tell him? That I think my dead great-aunt is monitoring the flight's corrections from whatever realm airline employees go to when their earthly routes are complete. That every bump and jostle seems to be cataloged by invisible fingers that know something about flying that the living have forgotten. Instead, I accept the peanuts and try to focus on rational explanations. Fatigue, stress, the power of suggestion amplified by thin air and reduced oxygen levels. The human mind's remarkable ability to create patterns and meaning from random sensory input. Yet as the flights continue, and they must continue because my work demands this coast-to-coast schedule, the sensations grow more detailed rather than less. I begin to distinguish different types of touch. The light counting during ordinary turbulence, a firmer pressure during more severe weather, and occasionally, something that feels almost like reassurance when the aircraft encounters the kind of rough air that sends unsecured items sliding across the cabin. On one memorable flight, caught in a storm system that stretches from Denver to Chicago, the touch becomes almost conversational. Each time the aircraft shudders through a particularly violent gust, I feel what can only be described as a pat on the back of my hand, as if someone is saying there in a language older than words. The other passengers seem oblivious. They grip their armrests, white-knuckled and tense, or bury their faces in magazines and phones. But none of them appear to experience anything beyond ordinary turbulence anxiety. I wonder if I'm the only one, or if there are others who feel similar presences but lack the family history to give them context. My research expands to include airline accident statistics, flight safety records, and the curious phenomenon of pilot corrections, the constant micro-adjustments that keep aircraft stable in unstable air. What I learn is that modern commercial aviation is essentially a series of continuous corrections, thousands of tiny inputs per hour that most passengers never notice, but that determine the difference between smooth flight and catastrophe. The pilot corrects, always corrects. The words from my original dream take on new meaning as I understand how literal they might be. Every moment in the air is a moment of active correction, of human and mechanical systems working together to maintain an artificial equilibrium in an environment that naturally resists our presence. Perhaps that's what the touch measures, not just the turbulence itself, but the quality of the corrections that follow. A professional assessment by someone who understands flight at a level deeper than engineering or physics, someone who knows the sky from the inside out. 3 months after the first dream, on another red-eye from LAX to JFK, I decide to test my theory. During a stretch of moderate chop over New Mexico, when I feel the familiar counting pressure begin, I close my eyes and try to extend my awareness beyond my own hand. For a moment, just a moment, I swear I can feel the aircraft through her perception, not the passenger's experience of turbulence as chaotic motion, but the pilot's view of it as a series of problems to be solved, adjustments to be made, courses to be corrected. The aircraft becomes less a vehicle and more a living thing, breathing with the air currents, responding to the sky's moods with subtle shifts in attitude and altitude. In that expanded awareness, I understand something that changes my relationship with flying forever. The corrections aren't just mechanical responses to atmospheric disturbance. They're a conversation between the aircraft and the element it moves through, a dance of accommodation and resistance that requires not just skill, but intuition, not just training, but instinct. And sometimes, when the dance becomes particularly complex, when the corrections require knowledge that goes beyond what the living can access, perhaps other forms of expertise become available. Perhaps the sky remembers its most dedicated servants, and occasionally offers their guidance to those who need it most. The touch fades as we enter calmer air, but this time, I don't feel its absence as loss. Instead, there's a sense of completion, as if something that needed to be understood has finally been communicated. The remaining flight passes in what might be the first truly peaceful sleep I've experienced at altitude, and I wake to the sight of New York's lights spreading below us like a circuit board designed by angels. I still don't know if what I experience is supernatural visitation or psychological adaptation, if my great-aunt truly watches over nervous flyers, or if my mind has simply found an elegant way to process aviation anxiety. But I've learned that some questions are more valuable for their asking than their answering, and that the space between explanation and mystery is where the most interesting truths tend to hide. Now, when turbulence rocks the cabin and other passengers grip their seats in white-knuckled terror, I place my hands palm down on the armrests and wait. Sometimes there's nothing, just the ordinary bumps and jolts of air travel. But sometimes, in those moments when the aircraft seems to hang between falling and flying, I feel those fingers again, counting corrections with the patience of someone who has all the time in the world. And in those moments, surrounded by 37,000 pounds of metal and flesh hurtling through thin air at 600 miles per hour, I am not afraid, because I know that somewhere in the space between physics and faith, between the mechanical and the mysterious, the pilot corrects, always corrects. Story 6. The sound comes at 3:07 a.m., always 3:07 a.m., not 3:06, not 3:08. As if whatever forces govern these things have developed an obsession with precision that I've grown to dread. Drip, drip, drip. 3 measured drops, then silence thick enough to suffocate. I've checked every pipe, every faucet, every possible source of water in this Denver apartment. The landlord sent maintenance twice. They found nothing. The sound doesn't come from the walls or the ceiling, or anywhere a reasonable person might expect water to manifest. It simply is, occupying the space between my ears and my sanity with the persistence of guilt. It started 6 weeks after Cusco. The vendor had been insistent, almost desperately so, pushing the small clay vessel into my hands with the kind of fervor that should have been my first warning. The morning market sprawled across the cobblestone plaza, a riot of colors and voices that seemed to pulse with the thin air at 11,000 feet. I'd been wandering, killing time before my flight back to Denver, when his weathered fingers wrapped around my wrist. Replica turistica, he'd said, but his eyes held something that contradicted his words. The Spanish rolled off his tongue with an urgency that made my chest tighten. Very authentic looking, yes? Very beautiful for your home. The vessel sat small and unassuming in my palm, its surface rough with age or careful craftsmanship designed to mimic age. Geometric patterns spiraled around its circumference in faded earth tones. Reds like dried blood, browns like fertile soil, yellows like old bone. Nothing spectacular. Nothing that screamed sacred or cursed, or any of the dramatic epithets my mind now insists on applying to it. How much? The price had been reasonable, almost suspiciously so for something he claimed was such a perfect replica of pre-Columbian pottery. I'd haggled anyway, more out of habit than necessity, and his relief when I agreed to pay seemed disproportionate to the small profit he'd make. The photograph I took in my hotel room shows nothing unusual. Just a clay pot sitting on the narrow windowsill. Cusco's red-tiled roofs stretching beyond the glass. But I've studied that image countless times since returning, searching for some detail I might have missed, some sign that I was carrying home something that should have remained buried in the Andes. The late afternoon light catches the vessel's surface in ways that create shadows where there should be none, depths that seem to shift when I'm not looking directly at them. The flight home was unremarkable. I'd wrapped the pot carefully in my dirty laundry, cushioned it against the turbulence of crossing the Continental Divide. It had felt light in my hands then, almost hollow, as if it contained nothing but air and ancient dust. Now it feels like it weighs 1,000 pounds, even from 3 states away. The first sign came 10 days after I'd placed it on my bookshelf, nestled between a collection of travel guides and novels I'd been meaning to read. I woke to find my work contract termination notice in my email, delivered at 4:17 a.m. by an automated system that had supposedly been scheduled weeks earlier. The explanation was corporate restructuring, budget cuts, nothing personal. Standard language that felt anything but standard when delivered in the pre-dawn darkness of my bedroom. The car accident followed 2 days later, a fender bender in a parking lot that shouldn't have happened. I'd been backing out of a space I'd navigated hundreds of times, when my brake pedal felt spongy, unresponsive. The impact was minor, just enough to crumple metal and inflate insurance premiums. But the other driver's face haunts me still. She'd looked at me through her windshield with an expression of profound sadness, as if she knew something about my circumstances that I didn't. "You okay?" I'd asked, but she'd only shaken her head and walked away after exchanging information, leaving me standing in the Denver suburbs, with the distinct feeling that I'd crossed some invisible line. The sinus infection came next, sudden and severe enough to strip away my sense of smell completely. One morning I could detect the coffee brewing in my kitchen. The next, I might as well have been living in a sensory void. Food became texture and temperature, nothing more. The world lost a dimension I hadn't realized I'd depended on until it vanished. But it was the water sounds that truly unraveled me. At first, I'd assumed the pipes were settling, adjusting to the late spring temperature fluctuations that plague Colorado's Front Range. Old buildings make noise, everyone knows this, but the sounds didn't behave like settling pipes or expanding metal. They moved through the walls with intention, following pathways that defied the apartment's plumbing layout. I'd press my ear to the drywall and hear rushing water where the building plans showed nothing but empty space. 3 weeks of this before I finally called my friend at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. I'd met him during graduate school, back when I'd harbored delusions of becoming an anthropologist instead of a corporate consultant. He'd specialized in pre-Columbian cultures, written his dissertation on ritual objects of the Inca Empire. The silence on his end of the phone call stretched long enough to make me wonder if the connection had dropped. "Can you send me the photos?" he'd finally asked. I'd emailed them immediately, then waited. His response came 6 hours later. "Call me." His voice when I reached him carried a weight I'd never heard before. He'd been examining the images, he said, consulting with colleagues, cross-referencing patterns and pottery styles in databases I couldn't begin to pronounce. "That's not a replica," he'd said finally, "and it shouldn't have left Peru." The words hit like cold water in my chest. I'd expected him to laugh, to reassure me that tourist markets were full of convincing fakes, that my recent string of bad luck was merely coincidence dressed up in post-travel anxiety. Instead, his professional composure had cracked just enough to let genuine concern seep through. "What do you mean?" "The ceramic composition, the firing technique, the iconography, none of it matches commercial replica work. This is authentic pre-Columbian pottery, probably ceremonial, and if it's what I think it is..." He'd paused, the kind of pause that carries its own gravity. These objects weren't made to be decorative, they were functional, sacred. Sacred how? That depends on what was kept inside. I'd hung up with my hands shaking and immediately began researching international antiquities laws, repatriation procedures, anything that might guide me through the process of undoing what I'd inadvertently done. The regulations were labyrinthine, designed by bureaucrats who'd never faced the prospect of having accidentally smuggled a sacred object across international borders. But the diplomatic mail service, I discovered, could handle sensitive returns without triggering customs investigations. It would take weeks to arrange, but it could be done quietly, professionally, with the kind of discretion that might preserve both the object's integrity and my own legal standing. I'd written the letter in Spanish, apologizing for the misunderstanding, explaining that I'd been deceived by the vendor's claims of the object being a replica. The words felt inadequate, like trying to apologize for stealing someone's ancestor, but I'd done my best to convey genuine remorse and a desire to make things right. The salt water had been my friend's suggestion. 3 nights, he'd said, to cleanse any residual energy that might be clinging to the object before I sent it back. I'd felt ridiculous preparing the bowl, dissolving sea salt in tap water like some suburban practitioner of folk magic, but desperation had eroded my skepticism. The change had been immediate. The morning after the 3rd night, I'd woken feeling lighter than I had in months. The oppressive weight that had settled over my daily routine lifted like morning fog, leaving me clear-headed and optimistic for the first time since Cusco. The water sounds continued, but they'd become softer, less insistent, as if whatever presence inhabited my walls had begun preparing for departure. I'd shipped the vessel that afternoon, watching the postal worker seal it in diplomatic packaging with the kind of relief usually reserved for the end of fever dreams. The tracking number became my talisman, proof that I'd done the right thing, that I'd corrected my mistake before any permanent damage had been done. For 3 weeks, silence. Blessed, complete silence. Then 3:07 a.m. arrived. Drip, drip, drip. The sound wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from inside my head, as if the water had found a new vessel to inhabit. I'd lie in bed, counting the seconds until the next sequence, watching my digital clock with the kind of attention usually reserved for bomb timers. The pattern never varied. 3 drops, exactly 67 seconds of silence, then 3 more drops. All night long, every night, with the mechanical precision of a metronome designed to measure insanity. I've tried everything: white noise machines, earplugs, even sleeping pills that leave me groggy but don't stop the sound. Nothing works. The dripping continues with the persistence of ocean tides, marking time in my skull with liquid punctuation marks. The package was delivered successfully, according to the tracking information. Signed for by someone at the Peruvian Ministry of Culture, processed through their repatriation department, presumably returned to wherever sacred objects go when tourists stop stealing them. I should feel vindicated, accomplished, relieved. Instead, I feel haunted. Because the more I research pre-Columbian ritual practices, the more I understand what my friend had been trying to tell me. These vessels weren't just containers. They were conduits, designed to hold not objects but relationships, connections between the living and something else, something that the Spanish conquistadors had spent centuries trying to eradicate. The vendor in Cusco hadn't been selling me a replica. He'd been giving me a responsibility. And responsibility, I'm learning, doesn't end with a return address. Last night I found myself standing in my kitchen at 3:06 a.m., waiting for the sound like a prayer call I've learned to anticipate. The darkness felt different somehow, less empty, as if it contained presences that had always been there but only now chose to make themselves known. The dripping came exactly on schedule, but this time it was accompanied by something else, the faint scent of mountain air and coca leaves, impossible to detect with my damaged sense of smell, yet somehow present nonetheless. For just a moment, I could swear I heard voices speaking in Quechua, words I didn't understand, carrying emotions I recognized all too well: disappointment, sorrow, infinite patience. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the vendor's face, the urgency in his weathered hands when he'd pressed the vessel into mine. Had he been trying to warn me, or had he been asking for help? Was I a random tourist who'd stumbled into someone else's spiritual crisis? Or had I been chosen for reasons I'm still too afraid to contemplate? The water sounds faded into silence, leaving me alone in my kitchen with questions that don't have comfortable answers. But in that silence, I finally understood what my friend had meant about objects being functional rather than decorative. The vessel hadn't been empty when I'd carried it home to Denver, and returning it to Peru hadn't sent back everything it had contained. Now I wait for 3:07 a.m. each night, listening for the sound of something that doesn't need water to measure time, something that's learned my schedule well enough to know exactly when I'm most vulnerable to doubt. The dripping has become a conversation I'm still learning how to understand, a reminder that some connections can't be severed by distance or good intentions. Tomorrow I'll begin researching flights back to Cusco. Not because I believe returning will solve anything, I'm past the point of such simple solutions, but because some debts can't be paid by mail. And somewhere in the Andes, at precisely 3:07 a.m. Mountain Time, I suspect someone else is lying awake, listening for the sound of rain that never comes, counting the seconds until a tourist learns the difference between souvenir and sacred trust. The weight of clay, I'm discovering, has nothing to do with physical mass. Drip, drip, drip. Time to begin again. Story 7. The first time I saw her, I thought it was my own reflection gone wrong. Dawn was breaking over Baltimore, casting that peculiar orange glow through the tall windows of my studio apartment. I'd been up all night again, hunched over my laptop, trying to make sense of the freelance writing assignments that barely kept me afloat. The coffee had long gone cold, and my eyes burned from staring at the screen. When I finally leaned back and stretched, that's when I caught her in the glass front of the old bookshelf. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, wearing what looked like a high-collared dress from another era. Her dark hair was pulled back and secured with a ribbon, a muted brown color, almost tan. The fabric of her dress seemed to shimmer slightly in the morning light, as if it were made of something heavier than modern material. Her posture was unnaturally straight, like someone posing for a portrait that would take several minutes to expose. My heart hammered against my ribs as I slowly turned around. The antique chair I'd bought at a flea market sat empty, its burgundy velvet seat catching the same amber light that had illuminated her figure in the reflection. But the air itself felt different, thicker somehow, carrying the distinct scent of old paper and leather bindings, the kind of smell you'd find in the forgotten corners of a library that hadn't been renovated since the 1940s. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for my pulse to slow, convincing myself it had been a trick of the light. The building was old, built in 1910 according to the landlord, and the windows were original, thick glass that distorted images and created false reflections. That had to be it. The stress, the sleepless nights, the isolation of working alone in a space that creaked and settled like a living thing. But when I returned to my laptop, I couldn't concentrate. Every few minutes, my eyes would dart to that bookshelf, scanning its glass surface for any sign of movement. The day dragged on, punctuated by the sounds of the building around me. Footsteps in the hallway above, pipes knocking within the walls, the distant hum of traffic on the street below. Normal sounds that suddenly felt intrusive, as if they were masking something else. Some other presence that moved through the space when I wasn't paying attention. That evening, I called my sister in California, needing to hear a familiar voice. I told her about the new place, how I was settling in, but I didn't mention the woman. How do you explain something like that without sounding like you're losing your grip? Instead, I listened to her talk about her job, her boyfriend, the mundane details of a life 3,000 miles away. After we hung up, the silence felt even more oppressive. I made dinner, watched Netflix, read until my eyes grew heavy. But when I finally climbed into bed, sleep wouldn't come. I found myself listening to the building's nighttime symphony, the settling wood, the whisper of air through old vents, the occasional footstep from a neighbor above, and beneath it all, something else. A sound so subtle it might have been my imagination, the soft rustle of fabric, as if someone were adjusting their skirts before sitting down. The second time I saw her was 3 weeks later. I'd fallen asleep at my desk again, face pressed against my forearm, keyboard keys imprinted on my cheek. The sun was just beginning to peek through the windows, painting everything in that same orange glow. As I lifted my head, still groggy from the uncomfortable sleep, there she was again in the glass. Same position, same dress, same ribbon holding back her dark hair. This time, I watched her for several long moments before turning around. In those seconds, I could have sworn I saw her right hand move, just slightly, fingers smoothing the fabric of her skirt. Her head tilted almost imperceptibly, as if she were listening to something I couldn't hear. The morning light seemed to pass through her in places, giving her the quality of a photograph that had been double exposed. When I finally spun around, the chair was empty again. But this time, I noticed something else. The seat cushion bore a slight indentation, as if someone had indeed been sitting there moments before. The velvet looked compressed, the way fabric does when weight has been resting on it for an extended period. I approached the chair cautiously, running my fingers over the surface. It felt cool to the touch, but not cold. Normal. The indentation could have been from the last time I'd sat there myself, though I couldn't remember when that might have been. I rarely used that chair. It was more decorative than functional, really. Something to fill the empty space between the bookshelf and the window. That's when I noticed the scent again. Stronger this time. Not just old books, but something else underlying it. A floral note, faint and sweet, like pressed flowers between dictionary pages. It reminded me of my grandmother's house, of afternoons spent in her sitting room while she read to me from books that smelled exactly like this. I spent the rest of that day researching the building's history. The Baltimore City Archives had records dating back to its construction, and I learned that it had originally been designed as upscale apartments for the city's growing professional class. The newspaper clippings from 1910 described it as modern luxury living, with the latest amenities, electric lighting, steam heat, telephone connections in every unit. But the building's story grew darker as the decades wore on. The stock market crash of 1929 had forced many residents to move out, and by the 1940s, it had been converted to smaller units, cramped spaces for factory workers and immigrants. I found a mention in a 1943 police report about a domestic disturbance in apartment 4B, my unit, but the details were frustratingly vague. Over the following weeks, I developed a routine around my morning encounters. I'd stay up late working, dozing off at my desk, then wake with the sunrise to catch glimpses of her in the glass. She appeared maybe once or twice a week, never predictably, always in the same pose. I began keeping a notebook, documenting each sighting, the weather conditions, the exact time, any changes in her appearance or position. What struck me most was how she never seemed to acknowledge my presence. She sat with the serene composure of someone posing for a portrait, gazing off toward something beyond my field of vision. Her hands never moved from their folded position, except for that one gesture I began to notice more frequently. A subtle lifting of her right hand toward her hair, fingers moving as if adjusting the ribbon that held it in place. But here's what made my skin crawl. Whenever she made that gesture, her fingers moved through empty air. There was no ribbon visible in the reflection. Her hair appeared to be held back by nothing at all, styled in a way that defied gravity. Yet her hand would move with the precise care of someone smoothing fabric, tucking strands, making minute adjustments to something that simply wasn't there. I started having trouble sleeping. Even when exhaustion finally claimed me, my dreams were filled with the sound of rustling fabric and that sweet, papery scent. I'd wake in the middle of the night convinced that someone was moving around in the apartment, but when I turned on the lights, everything was exactly as I'd left it. The isolation began to wear on me. I found myself talking aloud more often, filling the silence with my own voice. Sometimes I'd catch myself addressing comments to the empty chair, as if she might be sitting there listening, invisible to my direct gaze but somehow present nonetheless. My work started to suffer. Deadlines slipped by unnoticed. I'd sit at my computer for hours, typing and deleting the same paragraph over and over, distracted by peripheral movement that turned out to be nothing more than shadows shifting as the sun moved across the sky. Clients began complaining about missed calls and delayed projects. My savings account dwindled. It was during one of these particularly difficult periods that I met him. I was at Murphy's Pub on Thames Street, one of the few times I'd left the apartment in weeks. The bartender was a guy about my age, with the easy manner of someone who'd listened to too many sob stories to be surprised by much. We got to talking during the slow afternoon shift, and when he learned I lived in the old Whitman building on Monument Street, his expression changed. He leaned across the bar, lowering his voice despite the fact that we were practically alone. "You ever notice anything odd about that place?" The question hit me like ice water. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but something in my face must have given me away, because he nodded knowingly. "I lived there about 5 years ago," he continued, wiping down glasses with practiced movements. "4th floor, Unit B. Weird shit started happening after about a month. You know what I'm talking about, don't you?" I didn't trust myself to speak, so I just nodded. "The lady in the old-fashioned dress, right? Always messing with her hair, even though there's nothing there to mess with." He set down the glass and looked at me directly. First time I saw her, I thought I was losing my mind. Stress, you know? New job, new city, living alone for the first time. But then I started talking to some of the other tenants, and turns out I wasn't the only one. The relief I felt was almost overwhelming. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't having some kind of breakdown brought on by isolation and financial stress. Other people had seen her too. "Did you ever figure out who she was?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shrugged. "Mrs. Kowalski in 3A has been there since the 70s. She told me the story, though she swears she never saw the lady herself. Apparently, back in the 40s, there was a woman who lived in your unit. She was married to some guy who worked at the shipyards, but he was overseas fighting in the war. She'd sit by that big window every morning, waiting for letters that came less and less frequently." The bartender paused, seeming to consider how much to tell me. "The way Mrs. Kowalski tells it, the woman got word that her husband had been killed somewhere in the Pacific. After that, she just withdrew. Stopped leaving the apartment, stopped talking to the neighbors. People would see her sitting in that same chair every morning, still dressed up like she was expecting company, still checking the mail that never came. One day, the landlord found the apartment empty. She'd just disappeared, left everything behind, clothes, furniture, even her jewelry. Never saw her again." I felt a chill run down my spine. What happened to her? Nobody knows. Some folks think she just packed up and left town, started over somewhere else. But Mrs. Kowalski always suspected something darker. She said the woman had been acting strange those last few weeks, talking to herself, leaving food out for someone who wasn't there. The kind of behavior that makes people worried about someone's state of mind. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the story settling between us. "I moved out after about 4 months," he finally said. "Couldn't take it anymore. Every morning there she was, going through the same motions, adjusting that ribbon that wasn't there. It got to the point where I'd wake up and know she was going to be there before I even looked. Started making me feel like I was trapped in someone else's routine, you know?" That night, I returned to my apartment with a new perspective. The woman in the glass wasn't a threat. She was trapped, caught in the endless repetition of a morning ritual that had once brought her hope. Every dawn, she prepared herself for news that would never come, arranged her appearance for visitors who would never arrive. But understanding her story didn't make living with her presence any easier. The sightings became more frequent, sometimes occurring multiple times in a single week. I began to notice subtle changes in her appearance. Sometimes the dress appeared darker, more formal. Other times it seemed to shimmer with an almost ethereal quality. Her posture remained consistently perfect, but I started catching glimpses of her profile, the gentle curve of her cheek, the way her eyelashes cast shadows in the morning light. Most unsettling of all was the increasing clarity of her hand movements. The gesture of adjusting the invisible ribbon became more elaborate, more defined. I could see her fingers working with delicate precision, smoothing strands of hair, tucking them behind her ear, making minute adjustments with the care of someone preparing for an important photograph. I found myself synchronizing my schedule with her appearances, staying awake through the night so I could witness these dawn manifestations. My health deteriorated. I lost weight, developed a persistent tremor in my hands, jumped at every sound the building made. Friends and family members expressed concern during our increasingly infrequent phone calls. But how do you explain that you're being haunted by someone else's morning routine? The breaking point came on a particularly gray Tuesday in November. I'd been awake for nearly 36 hours straight, sustained by coffee and the kind of manic energy that comes from prolonged sleep deprivation. The sun was struggling to penetrate the thick cloud cover, casting everything in a dim, underwater light. When I saw her reflection in the bookshelf glass, she seemed more solid than usual, more present. This time, when she raised her hand to adjust the invisible ribbon, I spoke. "It's not there," I said aloud, my voice hoarse from disuse. "Whatever you're looking for, it's not there anymore." Her hand froze mid-gesture. For a moment that seemed to stretch forever, we both remained perfectly still. Me staring at her reflection, her fingers suspended in the air above her hair. Then slowly, she turned her head. Our eyes met in the glass. The contact lasted only a second before I spun around, heart hammering. The chair was empty, but the air was thick with that floral, papery scent, so strong it was almost suffocating. I stumbled backwards, knocking into my desk, sending papers scattering to the floor. That's when I saw it. Among the fallen documents was my old notebook from the first few months in the apartment. It had fallen open to a page where I'd been documenting her appearances, and there, pressed between the pages like a dried flower, was a piece of ribbon. Tan-colored, about 6 inches long, made of some kind of silk or satin that felt impossibly old and delicate between my fingers. I had never bought this ribbon. I had never seen it before in my life. I left that afternoon throwing my essentials into a duffel bag and booking a motel room across town. I told myself it was temporary, just until I could clear my head and figure out what was happening to me. But even as I locked the apartment door behind me, I knew I wouldn't be coming back. The moving truck came the following week. I supervised the packing from the doorway, refusing to enter the studio myself. The movers worked efficiently, loading my furniture and boxes into their truck, but I noticed they seemed uncomfortable in the space. One of them mentioned that the apartment felt close, as if the air itself were thick and oppressive. When they removed the antique chair, I thought I caught a glimpse of movement in the bookshelf glass, but I forced myself to look away. I've been living in a modern high-rise across town for 3 years now. The apartment has floor-to-ceiling windows, central air, all the amenities you'd expect from 21st century construction. I sleep through the night now. I've rebuilt my client base, gotten my finances back on track, even started dating someone I met at a coffee shop in Federal Hill. But I still have that piece of ribbon. It sits in my desk drawer, wrapped in tissue paper, alongside the notebook where I documented those early morning encounters. Sometimes, when I'm working late and the city lights reflect off my windows in strange patterns, I'll take it out and run it between my fingers. The fabric has a texture unlike anything modern, substantial but fragile, as if it might crumble at any moment. I've never been able to determine where it came from or how it got into my notebook. The rational part of my mind insists there must be a logical explanation. Maybe it was already there when I bought the notebook, or perhaps it blew in through an open window and I simply didn't notice it among my papers. But late at night, when the city grows quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts, I find myself wondering if she's still there. Still sitting in that antique chair every morning, hands folded in her lap, adjusting a ribbon that exists somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary sight. Still waiting for news that will never come, preparing for visitors who will never arrive. And sometimes, just before dawn, I catch myself running my fingers through my own hair, smoothing it back, making small adjustments to my appearance, as if someone might be watching. The gesture feels familiar, almost instinctive, like muscle memory from a routine I've never had. The ribbon remains in my drawer, tangible proof of something I can't explain. A fragment of someone else's story that has somehow become part of mine. And every morning, as the sun rises over Baltimore, I wonder if she's still there in that fourth-floor apartment, caught in the endless repetition of hope and preparation, her reflection visible only to those who happen to be looking at just the right moment, in just the right light. I wonder if she's still adjusting that ribbon, still smoothing her hair, still sitting with perfect posture as she waits for a world that has moved on without her. And I wonder if, someday, someone else will move into that studio apartment and see her in the glass of the old bookshelf, hands folded in her lap, making delicate adjustments to something that isn't there, something that exists somewhere else entirely, in a time and place where morning rituals still held the promise of good news, where dressing carefully and sitting up straight could somehow influence the arrival of letters that carried love across impossible distances. The ribbon in my drawer seems to grow heavier each day, as if it's absorbing something from the air around it. Memory, perhaps, or longing. Sometimes I think I should throw it away, break whatever connection it represents to that morning-lit studio and its eternal occupant. But I can't bring myself to do it, because deep down, in a part of myself I don't fully understand, I know that ribbon is the only thing keeping her tethered to a world where someone still remembers her story, still acknowledges her presence, still witnesses her daily preparation for a reunion that will never come. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us can ask for, to be remembered, to have our routines witnessed, to know that somewhere in the world, someone understands the importance of the small rituals that give our days meaning. Even if those rituals involve adjusting ribbons that exist only in the space between memory and hope, in the reflection of old glass at the break of day. Story 8. The brass mobile still turns when I close my eyes. 3 months ago, I would have called Uncle Ray crazy for keeping that thing hanging in the stairwell of his converted silo. Now I understand that some objects move not because of wind, but because of weight. The weight of things that shouldn't be there, pressing against the air like fingers testing the surface of still water. I came to the Kansas farm in late September, carrying nothing but a duffel bag and the kind of exhaustion that sleep can't cure. The kind that comes from watching your life collapse in slow motion, one missed deadline and failed relationship at a time. Ray offered me the guest room on the ground floor of the silo, his old grain storage tower that he'd converted into a farm office years ago. The bottom floor held filing cabinets and a small kitchenette. The middle floor housed his desk and computer equipment. The top floor was meant to be a break room, complete with a worn leather couch and a television mounted on the wall. A panoramic window wrapped halfway around the circular space, offering an unobstructed view of the highway that cut through the wheat fields like a scar. The first week passed without incident. I spent my days helping Ray with paperwork and my evenings on that third-floor couch, watching the hypnotic dance of headlights streaming past in the distance. The isolation felt like medicine after months of urban chaos. But isolation has a way of making you notice things you might otherwise dismiss. It started with the reflections. I had climbed to the top floor to turn off the television one Thursday evening when I caught sight of movement in the panoramic window. 4 figures sat on the couch behind me, perfectly aligned, all facing the highway. Their postures were unnaturally rigid, heads tilted at identical angles, as if they were listening to something I couldn't hear. The reflection was crystal clear despite the darkness outside, clearer, somehow, than my own face should have been in the glass. When I turned around, the couch was empty. I stood there for several minutes, my heart performing an irregular rhythm against my ribs. The leather cushions showed no indentations where the figures had been sitting. The air held no lingering warmth or scent of other people. Yet when I turned back to the window, there they were again. 4 adults in clothing I couldn't quite make out, sitting exactly as before, their attention fixed on the ribbon of asphalt beyond the wheat. I left the television on that night. The next morning, Ray mentioned over breakfast that he'd heard the TV running late into the night. His tone was casual, but there was something in his eyes that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd noticed odd sounds from the silo after dark. When I explained what I'd seen, he nodded slowly, the way a person might acknowledge bad weather. "Farm's got its ways," he said, returning to his eggs. "Always has." That afternoon, I called my therapist in Chicago. Dr. Martinez had warned me about the psychological effects of sudden isolation after prolonged stress. Hallucinations weren't uncommon, she assured me. The mind sometimes creates company when it finds itself alone after trauma. Her voice sounded tinny and distant through the old landline, as if she were speaking from another planet instead of just another state. I might have believed her explanation if not for the woman on the stairs. It happened 3 days later. I was heading up to the second floor to grab some files for Ray when I saw her on the middle landing. She wore a light-colored dress, cream or pale yellow, and her dark hair moved softly around her shoulders, as if stirred by a gentle breeze. She raised one hand in a slow, deliberate wave, her fingers spreading and closing in a gesture that seemed more goodbye than hello. The strangest part wasn't seeing her there. The strangest part was that her hair and dress moved with perfect fluidity, while the air around me remained completely still. No windows were open on the landing, no fans were running. Yet her clothing and hair swayed as if she stood in the middle of a summer meadow instead of a converted grain silo. I blinked, and she was gone. But the brass mobile hanging from the ceiling continued to spin lazily, its small chimes making soft metallic whispers in the motionless air. The sound followed me as I climbed the remaining steps, a delicate tinkling that seemed to comment on my presence like a disapproving tongue. That evening, Ray found me sitting at the kitchen table, staring at my untouched dinner. When I told him about the woman, he leaned back in his chair and studied the ceiling as if the answer to some unspoken question might be written there. "Was she pretty?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. Yes, I think so. It was hard to tell. "They usually are," he said. "Pretty, I mean. Or at least they seem that way." "They?" Ray stood and walked to the kitchen window, gazing out at the silo rising like a concrete finger against the darkening sky. "You're not the first guest who's seen things. Won't be the last, I'd guess." He refused to elaborate, despite my pressing. That night I locked the door to my ground floor room and pulled the curtains tight. But locks and curtains offer no protection against the sensation of being watched through walls, or the growing certainty that the silo itself was somehow aware of my presence. The awareness seemed to intensify as October deepened. I began noticing small changes in the building that couldn't be explained by settling concrete or fluctuating temperatures. Doors I'd left open would be closed when I returned. Files I'd organized would be scattered across Ray's desk in patterns that looked almost deliberate. Geometric arrangements that made no sense but felt oddly meaningful, like symbols in a language I'd once known but had forgotten. The reflections in the panoramic window became a nightly occurrence. Sometimes the 4 figures sat in their usual positions on the couch. Other times they stood pressed against the glass, their faces turned inward as if they were looking directly at me. I began to recognize subtle differences between them, the way one held his shoulders slightly hunched, how another's head tilted to the left, the particular way the woman among them kept her hands folded in her lap. The realization that I was learning to identify them individually should have terrified me more than it did. Instead, I found myself looking forward to their appearances. The isolation of the farm had become oppressive during the day, when Ray worked the far fields, and I was alone with nothing but paperwork and the sound of wind through wheat. The figures provided a strange comfort, like having roommates who never spoke or made demands, but whose presence meant I wasn't entirely alone. This comfort lasted until the night I saw myself among them. I had climbed to the third floor around 10 p.m., carrying a cup of coffee and planning to catch the late news. As I approached the couch, movement in the panoramic window caught my attention. The four figures sat in their usual positions, but now there was a fifth. A man in jeans and a flannel shirt, sitting exactly where I planned to sit, holding a coffee cup identical to the one in my hands. The reflected version of myself turned slightly and looked directly at me through the glass. His expression was patient and knowing, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for a very long time. He raised his coffee cup in a small salute, then turned back to face the highway with the others. I dropped my cup. The ceramic shattered against the concrete floor, sending coffee splashing across my shoes. When I looked up, the window reflected only darkness and my own startled face. But I could smell the coffee, not the spilled brew at my feet, but the phantom aroma of a fresh cup, warm and inviting in the cool air of the third floor. Ray found me the next morning, sitting on the stairs between the first and second floors. I'd spent the night there, unwilling to return to my room on the ground floor and unable to face the third floor window again. He took in the scene without comment, the broken coffee cup still scattered across the floor above, my rumpled clothes, the wild look in my eyes. "Time to go," he said simply. "I'm not crazy." The words came out harsher than I'd intended. "Never said you were." Ray settled onto the step beside me, his weathered hands clasped around his knees. "But staying here, it's not helping either of us." "What do you see when you go up there?" Ray was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years, decades of accumulated knowledge that he'd never wanted to possess. "Same as you, I expect. My brother and his wife, my parents, sometimes others, people who lived on this land before us, maybe. They sit up there most nights, watching the road like they're waiting for something that's never going to come." "Your family?" "Dead these 15 years, most of them. Car accident on that stretch of highway." He pointed toward the panoramic window above us, right where they like to watch. The brass mobile chimed softly in the silence that followed. I looked up to see it turning slowly, its delicate arms catching the morning light that filtered down from the third floor. "Why didn't you tell me? Would it have mattered? You needed a place to heal, and this place, it understands healing and loss. Maybe they're the same thing. I don't know." I packed that afternoon, but not before climbing to the third floor one final time. The panoramic window showed only the highway and the endless wheat fields beyond. No figure sat on the couch. No reflections moved in the glass. But as I turned to leave, the brass mobile began to spin without any discernible cause. Its chimes created a melody I'd never heard before, something wistful and welcoming, like a lullaby sung by someone who loved you, but could no longer hold you close. I drove away that evening, watching the silo shrink in my rearview mirror until it became just another structure in the landscape. But even now, 3 states away and 6 weeks gone, I find myself looking for it when I close my eyes. Not the building itself, but the comfort of knowing that some places hold on to the people who matter, even after they're gone, especially after they're gone. The brass mobile turns in my memory, chiming a song of welcome for all the lost souls who need somewhere to rest, somewhere to watch the road and wait for whatever comes next. And sometimes, in the moments between sleep and waking, I think I can still smell coffee brewing in the third floor break room, as if someone is up there even now, watching the highway and saving a place on the couch for the next traveler who needs to learn the difference between being alone and being truly lost. The farm accepts its ghost the way it accepts wind, as a natural part of the landscape, necessary and eternal. And perhaps that acceptance is the closest thing to peace any of us will ever find, living or dead, in the vast loneliness of the Kansas plains. Story 9. The Hartwell Inn squatted against the October sky like a guilty secret, its Victorian gables clawing at the dusk. I should have driven the extra 40 miles to Albany, when the desk clerk's eyes flickered with something that might have been pity as she slid the brass key across the mahogany counter. "Room 7, she said, the only one left, the only one nobody wanted. The narrow hallway stretched before me, wallpaper peeling at the edges like old skin, floorboards groaning their displeasure with each step. Electric sconces cast trembling shadows that seemed to retreat just ahead of my movement, as if the house itself were leading me deeper into its bowels. The brass key felt unnaturally cold between my fingers, and I found myself gripping it tighter as I climbed the creaking staircase to the second floor. Room 7 sat at the end of the corridor, isolated from its neighbors by what felt like deliberate design. The door opened with a protest that echoed down the hallway, and I stepped into air that tasted of lavender and something else, something metallic and sharp that caught in my throat. The room was larger than I'd expected, with tall windows that faced the woods behind the inn. Moonlight filtered through lace curtains, casting intricate patterns across hardwood floors that had been polished to an unnatural shine. An ornate four-poster bed dominated the center of the space, its burgundy coverlet pulled tight with military precision. But it wasn't the bed that made my breath catch in my chest. Against the far wall stood a massive glass-fronted cabinet, and within its depths sat the most extensive collection of dolls I'd ever seen outside of a museum. They occupied every shelf, arranged with meticulous care, porcelain faces painted with expressions that ranged from serene to unsettling, glass eyes that caught and reflected the lamplight in ways that made them seem almost alive, Victorian ladies in elaborate gowns, children in sailor suits, babies with rosebud mouths that seemed perpetually on the verge of crying. There had to be 40 or 50 of them, maybe more. Their faces turned toward the bed as if they were an audience waiting for a performance to begin. I set my overnight bag on the floor and approached the cabinet, drawn by a mixture of fascination and revulsion. The dolls stared back at me through the glass, their painted expressions frozen in time. Some smiled with lips that were too red, too perfect. Others gazed with wide, innocent eyes that seemed to follow my movement. One, a particular specimen with blonde ringlets and a blue velvet dress, appeared to be looking directly at me, her porcelain features arranged in what could have been invitation or warning. The sensation of being watched settled over me like a heavy coat. I backed away from the cabinet and busied myself with unpacking, but I could feel those dozens of eyes tracking my every movement. When I reached into my bag for my toiletries, my fingers closed around the familiar weight of my grandfather's pocket knife, a habit from childhood camping trips that had somehow persisted into my adult travels. I placed the knife on the nightstand beside the bed, its worn wooden handle offering a small measure of comfort in this strange room. It was psychological, I knew, a placebo of courage, nothing more. But sometimes the mind needs its talismans, its small acts of rebellion against the darkness. The rest of my evening routine felt surreal under the watchful gaze of the dolls. I brushed my teeth in the small adjoining bathroom, where the mirror showed a face more drawn and tired than I remembered. The fluorescent light above the sink flickered intermittently, casting my reflection in strobe-like intervals that made me appear to blink in and out of existence. When I returned to the main room, I noticed that the moonlight had shifted, creating new patterns on the floor, new angles of shadow that seemed to transform the doll's expressions. What had appeared benevolent before now looked calculating. What had seemed innocent now carried undertones of menace. I turned off the bedside lamp and slipped beneath the covers, pulling them up to my chin like a child afraid of monsters. The room fell into darkness, but not complete darkness. The moon was full enough to keep the cabinet and its occupants visible as pale shapes against the far wall. I closed my eyes and tried to will myself to sleep, but my ears seemed hypersensitive in the quiet, picking up every creak of the old building, every whisper of wind through the eaves. Sleep began to claim me despite my unease. That soft descent into unconsciousness where reality becomes negotiable and the impossible seems merely improbable. My breathing deepened, my muscles relaxed, and I felt myself sinking into the mattress as if the bed were slowly swallowing me. That's when I heard it. A voice, soft as silk and light as air, speaking directly into my ear as if someone were lying beside me on the pillow. The words themselves were innocuous enough, delivered in the sing-song cadence of a young woman, almost childlike in its innocence. In here, desires always come true. My eyes snapped open, my body instantly rigid with terror. The room was empty. I could see every corner, every shadow. The dolls remained in their cabinet, motionless as death. But I could have sworn I felt warm breath against my ear, could still hear the echo of that whispered promise floating in the air like smoke. I lay there for what felt like hours, muscles locked in paralysis, waiting for something else to happen. Every small sound made me flinch. The settling of the old building, the distant hoot of an owl, the barely perceptible tick of a clock somewhere in the walls. But nothing came. Just the oppressive weight of those glass eyes watching me from across the room, patient as predators. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I drifted into a fitful sleep populated by dreams of porcelain faces and whispered promises. When morning finally broke through the lace curtains, I woke feeling as if I hadn't slept at all, my body aching and my mind foggy with the residue of nightmares I couldn't quite remember. I showered quickly, eager to leave the room behind, but as I packed my belongings, I found myself glancing repeatedly at the knife on the nightstand. Something about it bothered me, though I couldn't put my finger on what. It looked the same. Worn wooden handle, tarnished brass fixtures, the blade safely folded inside. But it felt different somehow, as if its presence in this room had changed its fundamental nature. I slipped it into my travel bag and tried to shake off the sensation. Probably just my imagination, overwrought from a night of poor sleep and strange dreams. The mind plays tricks when it's tired, creates connections where none exist, finds meaning in coincidence. The second night, I made a deliberate choice. I buried the knife deep in my suitcase, refusing to give in to whatever psychological crutch it represented. If I was going to sleep in this room, and the inn was booked solid due to some local festival, I would do it on my own terms, without talismans or superstitions. This time, sleep came more easily. The dolls were still there, still watching, but familiarity had dulled their unsettling effect. I found I could ignore them, could pretend they were just collections of porcelain and cloth, nothing more significant than furniture. The building's night sounds became background noise, and I drifted off with something approaching peace. I slept deeply, dreamlessly, for what felt like the first time in months. No whispered voices, no sensation of being watched. Just the blessed oblivion of true rest. When I woke, sunlight was streaming through the windows, and I felt genuinely refreshed for the first time since arriving at the inn. But something was wrong. There, on the pillow beside my head, lay a delicate handkerchief made of the finest lace I'd ever seen. It was folded with precise care, its edges forming perfect right angles, as if someone had spent considerable time arranging it just so. The lace was old, antique, possibly Victorian, worked in patterns so intricate they seemed to move and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I sat up slowly, afraid to disturb whatever careful balance had been struck during the night. The handkerchief was definitely not mine. I owned nothing so delicate, so feminine. It belonged to another era, another world entirely. Yet here it was, placed with deliberate care next to where I had lain sleeping. My first instinct was to call the front desk, to demand an explanation. Perhaps housekeeping had come in during the night. But the door had been locked, and I was a light sleeper under normal circumstances. Besides, what kind of housekeeping service left antique lace on guests' pillows? I picked up the handkerchief with trembling fingers, expecting it to dissolve like a mirage or transform into something else entirely. But it was real. I could feel its weight, could see the play of morning light through its delicate patterns. It smelled of lavender and something else, something I couldn't identify but that made my stomach churn with inexplicable dread. As I held it, I became aware that the dolls in the cabinet seemed different this morning. Not physically changed. They occupied the same positions, wore the same expressions, but there was something in the quality of their attention that had shifted. Before, they had watched with the idle curiosity of observers. Now, they seemed to be waiting for something, their painted eyes bright with anticipation. I dropped the handkerchief as if it had burned me and began packing frantically. Whatever was happening in this room, whatever game was being played, I wanted no part of it. I stuffed my belongings into my bag with no regard for organization, driven by a primitive need to escape that I couldn't fully rationalize. But as I reached for the door handle, I found myself turning back for one last look at the cabinet. The doll with the blonde ringlets and blue velvet dress, the one who had seemed to look directly at me that first night, was smiling. I was certain she hadn't been smiling before. Her rosebud mouth was curved in an expression of secret satisfaction, as if she knew something I didn't, as if she had accomplished something important while I slept. I ran then, fled down the hallway and stairs like a guilty thing, my bag bouncing against my leg with each hurried step. The desk clerk looked up as I burst into the lobby, her face arranging itself into professional concern. "Checking out early, sir?" I nodded, not trusting my voice, and thrust the brass key across the counter. She took it without comment, but I caught the brief flicker in her eyes, the same expression I'd seen when she'd given me the room in the first place. Not pity, I realized now. Recognition. The look of someone who had seen this before, who knew exactly what had driven me from room 7 in such obvious haste. "I hope your stay was comfortable," she said, the pause just long enough to be meaningful. I managed to mumble something affirmative and stumbled toward the exit, but her voice followed me. "The room has quite a history, you know. Victorian era. They say the original owner's daughter collected dolls, spent all her time with them, talking to them, treating them like real people. After she passed, her father couldn't bear to part with the collection. Said she'd have wanted them to stay together, to keep each other company." I paused at the door, my hand on the brass handle, unable to resist asking, "What happened to her?" The clerk's smile was sad and knowing. "Oh, she didn't die, sir. She just chose to stay. Some people find exactly what they're looking for in room 7, and some find what they didn't know they were looking for." I pushed through the door without responding, but her words followed me into the crisp morning air. As I loaded my car, I couldn't resist one last glance up at the second-floor windows. There, barely visible through the lace curtains of room 7, I could swear I saw a figure standing at the glass. Small, delicate, dressed in blue velvet. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing there but shadows and light. The drive home passed in a blur of autumn scenery and racing thoughts. I tried to rationalize what had happened, to find logical explanations for the voice, the handkerchief, the subtle changes I'd perceived in the dolls. Stress, I told myself. Poor sleep. An overactive imagination fed by the gothic atmosphere of the old inn. These things had reasonable explanations if I was willing to accept them. But late that night, as I unpacked in the safety of my own apartment, I found something that made my blood run cold. There, nestled between my shirts, was the antique lace handkerchief. The one I had left behind in my panic to escape room 7. The one I was certain I hadn't packed. It lay folded with the same precise care I'd found it with that morning, its intricate patterns seeming to shift and dance in the light from my bedroom lamp. And as I stared at it, trying to understand how it could possibly be here, I could swear I heard something, faint as a whisper, sweet as a promise. Desires always come true. I picked up the handkerchief with shaking hands, and for just a moment, I could smell lavender and something else. Something that might have been perfume from another century, or might have been nothing at all. In that moment, standing in my familiar apartment surrounded by my familiar things, I realized that some questions are more dangerous than their answers. The handkerchief sits in my dresser drawer now, folded with care I didn't know I possessed. Sometimes, late at night when sleep eludes me, I find myself thinking about room 7 and its watchful occupants. About the clerk's knowing smile and the figure I might have seen at the window. About the voice that promised desires fulfilled. And the growing certainty that some promises, once made, are impossible to break. I tell myself it was all imagination, all stress and suggestion, and the power of old buildings to make us believe in ghosts. But deep down, in the part of my mind that still believes in magic and monsters, I know better. I know that somewhere in upstate New York, in a Victorian inn that squats against the sky like a guilty secret, 47 porcelain faces wait patiently for the next guest who will take the room nobody wants. And sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I find myself wondering what desire of mine is slowly, inevitably, coming true. Story 10. The apartment smelled like stale coffee and someone else's laundry detergent, that synthetic lavender scent that clings to everything and nothing simultaneously. My colleague had left 3 days earlier for his conference in Portland, and I'd been grateful for the temporary refuge from my own cramped studio across town. The rent in Seattle was bleeding me dry, and a week of free accommodation seemed like a gift from whatever god still bothered with broke graduate students. The living room faced west, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering an unobstructed view of Elliott Bay during the day. But at night, those same windows became mirrors, reflecting the warm glow of the apartment's interior back at me, with an intensity that made the space feel smaller, more contained. The massive flat-screen TV dominated the wall opposite the windows, its black surface acting as another mirror when turned off, a dark, perfect rectangle that seemed to watch the room even in its dormancy. I'd been there 2 nights without incident. Working on my thesis about media manipulation in post-digital society, I'd spread my research materials across the coffee table and settled into a comfortable routine. The apartment was quiet, except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. It was exactly 10 o'clock when it happened. The TV screen flickered to life with the harsh brightness of an old tube television, though this was clearly a modern LED display. The volume jumped to an uncomfortable level, not quite loud enough to disturb neighbors, but aggressive enough to make me flinch. The image that appeared wasn't the Netflix homepage or cable menu I'd expected, but a local news broadcast with the unmistakable aesthetic of something recorded months earlier. The female anchor's hair was styled in a way that seemed slightly off, as if I were looking at footage from a different season. Her makeup was perfect, but there was something artificial about the way the studio lights hit her face, creating shadows that seemed to move independently of her gestures. She was discussing a water main break on Capitol Hill, an event I vaguely remembered from the previous spring. I reached for the remote, but it wasn't on the coffee table where I'd left it. The couch cushions yielded nothing, and a quick search of the immediate area proved fruitless. The anchor continued her report with mechanical precision, her voice carrying that particular cadence of local television, enthusiastic yet hollow, designed to convey urgency about fundamentally unurgent events. The timestamp in the corner of the screen confirmed my suspicion. This broadcast was from 4 months ago. But there was something else, something that made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. The anchor's eyes seemed to be looking directly at me, not at the camera, but at me specifically, me. Every few seconds, her gaze would shift slightly, following my movement across the room as I searched for the remote. I found it wedged between the arm of the couch and a throw pillow, exactly where I hadn't looked twice before. The moment my fingers closed around it, the TV shut off with a soft electronic sigh, leaving me staring at my own reflection in the black screen. The sudden silence felt oppressive, as if the apartment itself was holding its breath. Sleep came fitfully that night. I kept thinking about the anchor's eyes, the way they seemed to track my movement. In my dreams, I was trapped inside that news studio, sitting in an audience that didn't exist, watching myself watch television in an endless recursive loop. The next day passed without incident. I worked on my thesis, took breaks to walk around the neighborhood, and tried to shake the unease that had settled in my chest like cold water. The apartment felt different in daylight, more normal, more like a space occupied by living people rather than something suspended between frequencies. But as evening approached, I found myself watching the clock with growing anxiety. At 9:45, I positioned myself directly in front of the TV with the remote in my hand, determined to solve whatever technical malfunction had occurred the night before. The screen remained black as 10 o'clock arrived and passed. I felt foolish, sitting there staring at my own reflection, remote pointed at a television that showed no sign of spontaneous activity. The minutes ticked by, 10:01, 10:02, 10:03, and nothing happened. Then I unplugged it. The power cord came free from the wall socket with a soft pop, and I coiled it carefully before placing it on the coffee table where I could see it. No electricity meant no mysterious broadcasts, no matter what kind of technical glitch had occurred the night before. At exactly 10 o'clock, the screen flashed on. For just a second, less than a second, the display blazed with that harsh, unnatural light. In that brief instant, I saw a face looking back at me from the black screen. not reflected in it, but emerging from within it, as if someone was standing just behind the glass surface of the display. The face was colorless, drained of all warmth and vitality, with eyes that fixed on mine with an intensity that felt like physical pressure. Then darkness returned, leaving me staring at my own pale reflection, the unplugged power cord still visible in my peripheral vision. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on the couch researching television technology, looking for any explanation for how a display could activate without power. I found articles about capacitor discharge and phantom power draw, technical explanations that felt reassuring in the blue glow of my laptop screen. By dawn, I'd almost convinced myself that what I'd experienced was some kind of electrical phenomenon combined with exhaustion and suggestion. The rational explanation lasted until I returned to my own apartment. My studio was cramped and cluttered, dominated by an ancient 27-inch CRT television I'd inherited from my grandmother. It was the kind of old-fashioned TV that took 30 seconds to warm up and produced a small explosion of static when turned off. I'd had it for years without any unusual behavior, but that first night back in my own space, it began its own 10 o'clock ritual. The old television came to life with a wash of static, the screen resolving into the same local news broadcast I'd seen in my colleague's apartment. Same anchor, same artificial lighting, same 4-month-old water main story. But this time, when she looked at me, her colorless face smiled. I yanked the plug from the wall, and the screen died immediately. No lingering glow, no gradual fade, just instant blackness. But in the reflection on the curved glass surface, that face remained for a moment longer, watching me with empty eyes before dissolving into my own distorted image. The pattern established itself over the following weeks. Every television I encountered seemed infected with the same temporal anomaly. The TV in the laundromat where I did my washing, the monitor in the computer lab at the university, the display screens at the coffee shop where I sometimes studied. At 10 o'clock, they would show me that same broadcast, that same anchor with her practiced smile and hollow gaze. I stopped staying in public places after 10 p.m. I avoided friends' apartments, declined invitations to watch movies, and found excuses to leave restaurants and bars before the crucial hour. But the isolation only made things worse. In the absence of external stimuli, my mind began to fill in gaps with increasingly disturbing possibilities. What if the broadcast wasn't a recording at all, but something happening in real time in a place that existed parallel to our world? What if the colorless face I'd seen was trying to communicate something urgent, something I was too frightened to understand? The rational part of my mind insisted that stress and sleep deprivation were creating a persistent hallucination, but the rational part of my mind was growing quieter each day. 3 weeks after leaving my colleague's apartment, I decided to test the limits of whatever was happening to me. I borrowed a friend's car and drove to an electronics store 20 minutes outside the city. The showroom floor was filled with dozens of televisions displaying different channels, different content, a wall of moving images, and competing audio tracks. I positioned myself in the center of the room and waited. At exactly 10 o'clock, every screen in the store switched to the same channel. The cacophony of different programs was replaced by the uniform sound of that familiar news broadcast echoing from dozens of speakers simultaneously. Every display showed the same anchor, the same studio, the same 4-month-old report about infrastructure failure. But this time, she wasn't alone. Standing behind her, barely visible in the studio's artificial lighting, were other figures. Colorless faces with empty eyes, all looking directly at me through the multitude of screens. Some stood close enough to the news desk to be partially visible. Others were mere suggestions of presence in the shadows at the edge of the frame. The anchor finished her report and turned to face the camera, to face me directly. Her mouth opened, and though I couldn't hear her words over the sound of my own heartbeat, I could see her lips forming syllables with careful precision. She was saying my name. All of them were saying my name, a chorus of colorless faces speaking in perfect unison from dozens of screens, their voices just quiet enough to be almost inaudible, but persistent enough to burrow into my consciousness. The sound followed me as I ran from the store, echoing in my ears long after I'd reached my car and driven back into the city, with the radio turned up as loud as I could bear. That was 2 months ago. Since then, I've learned to live with the 10 o'clock appointments. I've stopped trying to avoid them or understand them. Instead, I sit in my apartment each evening and watch the broadcast with the same dutiful attention I might give to any regular programming. The anchor has started delivering different news now. Reports about events that haven't happened yet. Stories about accidents and discoveries and political changes that unfold exactly as she predicts them over the following days and weeks. Sometimes she mentions me by name, usually in contexts that seem significant but remain opaque until later. Last night, she told me that someone would be moving into my colleague's apartment soon. Someone who would need a temporary place to stay while they figured out their living situation in the city. She said this person would be grateful for any help they could get, and that I should remember to be generous with my time and advice. This morning, I received a text from my colleague. He's returning from his extended research trip and wondered if I knew anyone who might need a place to stay for a week or two while they looked for permanent housing. He mentioned that a graduate student from his department would be arriving next week, someone who was new to Seattle and didn't know anyone in the city. I've already agreed to help. I plan to give this person all the advice they need about living in my colleague's apartment. I'll tell them about the building's quirks, about which restaurants deliver late, about the best routes to avoid traffic, but I won't mention the television. Some discoveries I've learned have to be made individually. Some 10 o'clock appointments can't be transferred or explained. They have to be earned through the particular combination of circumstance and receptivity that allows certain truths to become visible. I've been thinking about this while watching my reflection in the black screen of my grandmother's old television, waiting for 10 o'clock to arrive. In a few minutes, the anchor will appear with her colorless smile and her gentle, hollow voice, and she'll tell me something new about the world that exists in the space between channels, between moments, between the person I was and the person I'm becoming. The clock on my wall reads 9:59. I can already see her face beginning to form in the darkness of the screen, superimposed over my own reflection like a double exposure. She's smiling, and behind her, more figures are gathering in the shadows of that impossible studio. A congregation of colorless faces all turn toward me with expectant eyes. The second hand sweeps toward 12, and I lean forward to listen carefully to whatever she has to tell me tonight. After all, I've learned that her advice is always worth following, even when I don't understand it at first. Especially when I don't understand it at first. Story 11. The ritual began 3 months after I moved into the Kenwood Avenue apartment. Nothing dramatic precipitated it. No break-in, no strange noise in the night. Just the gradual understanding that the corridor connecting my bedroom to the rest of the apartment demanded respect. 37 steps from my door to the kitchen, 22 to the living room, and every single one requiring acknowledgement of what lay at either end before I dared traverse that stretch of hardwood. Left. The kitchen, with its single window facing the intersection where East 47th meets the avenue, perpetually bathed in the amber glow of sodium streetlights and the intermittent red-green pulse of the traffic signal. Right. The living room. Darker, more contained, where the heavy curtains I'd inherited from the previous tenant blocked most external illumination. Both ends had to be visually confirmed clear before I could walk between them. It seemed reasonable at the time, a practical habit born from urban caution. The apartment building itself carried the weight of Chicago's architectural ambitions from the 1920s. Thick walls, high ceilings, and crown molding that cast intricate shadows when light hit it at certain angles. My neighbors were ghosts. I heard them sometimes, footsteps above, muffled conversations through shared walls. But in 6 months of living there, I'd encountered only the elderly woman from 4B, who nodded politely when we passed in the lobby and nothing more. My job as a data analyst for a logistics company allowed me to work mostly from home, which meant I spent considerable time in that apartment, learning its rhythms. The building settled differently depending on temperature and humidity. The radiators had their own language of clicks and hisses. The refrigerator hummed in a pattern I could predict. 43 seconds of silence, then a low rumble for exactly 2 minutes and 17 seconds. These details mattered because they formed the baseline of normalcy against which everything else could be measured. The corridor ritual worked perfectly until that October night when the familiar parameters shifted. I'd finished reviewing quarterly shipping reports and was heading to the kitchen for a late dinner when I paused at my bedroom doorway, following protocol. Right side, living room adequately lit by the standing lamp I'd left on. Empty leather chair positioned at its usual angle. Nothing amiss. Left side, kitchen shrouded in darkness deeper than usual. The street light that typically provided ambient illumination apparently dimmed or blocked. But there was something else. A shape against the window, motionless and wrong in its stillness. My eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness, and the form became clearer, human in outline, but strangely rigid, as if frozen mid-gesture. The traffic light outside pulsed its regular sequence, and when it shifted to red, the entire figure seemed to glow with that crimson wash, like a photograph developed in a dark room under colored filters. Every instinct screamed retreat. I backed into my bedroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of my bed listening to my own heartbeat echo in my ears. The building's familiar sounds continued around me. Someone's television murmuring through the walls, the elevator mechanism cycling in the distance, water running through pipes somewhere above. Normal sounds, but they felt contaminated now by what I'd seen. Sleep came in fragments. I'd drift off only to wake with the sensation that something had changed in the apartment, that footsteps had crossed the corridor while I dozed, that my bedroom door had been tested quietly from the outside. Each time I checked, the lock held firm and silence greeted me. Dawn arrived gray and reluctant, filtered through October clouds that promised rain. I unlocked my bedroom door and stepped into the corridor, checking both ends according to protocol. Kitchen, empty, morning light revealing nothing unusual. Living room, unchanged from the night before. Whatever I'd seen was gone. But when I opened the refrigerator to retrieve milk for coffee, everything inside had been rearranged. Not randomly, deliberately. Every bottle, every jar, every container had been positioned to create a single line, all their labels facing the same direction, pointing like arrows toward the exact spot where the figure had stood by the window. The milk carton pointed there. The ketchup bottle pointed there. Even the small jar of olives I'd forgotten about was angled precisely to indicate that specific location. My hands trembled as I returned the items to their normal positions, trying to convince myself I'd simply forgotten how I'd organized things the previous day. But the alignment had been too perfect, too purposeful. Someone, or something, had sent a message. The red light began appearing that same day. Every time I crossed the corridor, regardless of the hour, the streetlight outside would pulse red, just as I reached the midpoint of my journey, not the traffic signal. That continued its normal pattern. This was different, deeper, more saturated, as if the light itself had changed frequency. I tested it repeatedly, walking back and forth, and the timing never varied. 7 steps from either end of the corridor, the red light would flicker on for exactly 3 seconds, then fade back to its usual amber glow. I told myself it was coincidence, then pattern recognition gone haywire, then simple confirmation bias. But after 2 weeks of consistent behavior, scientific explanations began to feel like desperate rationalization. I started timing my corridor crossings during different traffic light cycles. Green, yellow, red, it made no difference. My red light operated on its own schedule. Work became a refuge from the apartment's growing strangeness. I'd leave early in the morning and return as late as possible, sometimes sitting in my car in the building's parking lot for an extra hour just to delay going upstairs. But the ritual still demanded compliance. Check both ends of the corridor. Verify safety. Cross quickly while the red light pulsed its acknowledgement. The woman from 4B stopped acknowledging me in the lobby. When I nodded to her, she'd look straight through me as if I wasn't there. The building superintendent, a gruff man who'd always been friendly enough to chat about Chicago weather or the Cubs' prospects, began avoiding eye contact entirely. I started to wonder if something about me had changed, if whatever was happening in my apartment was somehow visible to others, marking me in ways I couldn't perceive. November brought the first snow, and with it an escalation. The red light began appearing in other locations throughout the apartment. I'd be washing dishes and catch a red gleam in the chrome faucet. I'd be reading in bed and notice the lamp casting red shadows instead of its usual warm yellow. I'd wake up to find the digital clock displaying the correct time but in red numbers instead of green. The refrigerator incidents became more frequent and elaborate. Items wouldn't just point toward the window, they'd form patterns. Once I found every container arranged in a perfect spiral with the window as its center. Another time they spelled out shapes I couldn't quite identify, geometric forms that seemed familiar but just beyond recognition. I began photographing these arrangements before disturbing them, building a collection of evidence for something I couldn't name. My sleep deteriorated. The apartment felt occupied even when I was alone, filled with a presence that didn't announce itself but couldn't be ignored. I'd lie awake listening for sounds that weren't there, watching for movements in the darkness of my bedroom, feeling observed from angles that should have been empty. The corridor outside my door hummed with activity I couldn't verify. Footsteps that stopped just before I could open the door to check. Whispered conversations that faded the moment I tried to focus on them. I started leaving lights on throughout the apartment, thinking illumination might discourage whatever was happening. Instead, it seemed to provide better conditions for the red light to manifest. Now I could see it clearly as it pulsed through every room, reflecting off surfaces, creating a network of crimson signals that followed me wherever I went. The building's other tenants began to seem different. I'd pass someone in the hallway and they'd turn to watch me with expressions I couldn't interpret. Not hostile, not friendly, but intensely focused, as if they were memorizing details about my appearance or behavior. Conversations would stop when I approached the lobby. Footsteps would pause when I passed someone on the stairs. I considered breaking the lease, finding another apartment, but the rational part of my mind insisted this was exactly what whatever was happening wanted. Displacement, disruption, abandonment of normal life patterns. Running away felt like surrender to delusion. Besides, I'd grown oddly attached to the corridor ritual. It had become the one constant in my destabilizing existence, the single action that still felt under my control. December brought new developments. The red light began appearing before I entered the corridor, as if anticipating my movements. I'd stand in my bedroom doorway, preparing for the usual check, and the light would already be pulsing, waiting for me. Sometimes it would pulse 3 times, sometimes 7, sometimes in patterns that seemed almost like Morse code, but never quite resolved into recognizable messages. The figure returned on the winter solstice. I was working late on year-end reports when I followed my ritual and saw it again. The same motionless shape silhouetted against the kitchen window. The same red illumination making it glow like heated metal. This time I forced myself to approach instead of retreating. Each step forward felt like moving through thick liquid, the air itself resisting my progress. The figure remained perfectly still as I drew closer, its outline becoming clearer. Human in shape but wrong in proportion, as if someone had stretched a photograph vertically or viewed a normal person through a distorting lens. The red light that illuminated it seemed to come from within rather than from outside, pulsing in rhythm with something I couldn't identify. When I reached the kitchen threshold, the figure turned. Not quickly, not dramatically, just a slow rotation of its head until it faced me directly. Where its face should have been, there was only the red glow, featureless and unwavering. We stood there for an infinite moment, observer and observed, while the building's familiar sounds continued around us, as if nothing extraordinary was happening. Then it gestured toward the refrigerator. I opened the door with hands that had gone completely numb. Inside, every item had been arranged to spell out words in that same pointing pattern I'd seen so many times before. But now the message was clear, unavoidable, written in the language of condiment bottles and leftover containers. "You see us now." The figure nodded once, as if confirming I'd understood, then began to fade. Not disappearing suddenly, but gradually becoming transparent. The red glow dimming until only the ordinary streetlight outside remained. I stood alone in my kitchen, staring at the refrigerator's message, while my rational mind tried to process what had just occurred. I rearranged the items back to their normal positions, but my hands were shaking so badly I knocked over the milk carton, sending white liquid spreading across the shelves. As I cleaned up the mess, I noticed something else had changed. The kitchen window, which had always provided a clear view of the intersection below, now showed only darkness. Not the darkness of night. This was different, absolute, as if someone had painted the glass black from the outside. The corridor ritual continues. Every time I need to cross from my bedroom to the rest of the apartment, I check both ends, verify safety, and walk quickly while the red light pulses its acknowledgement. But the parameters have shifted again. Now I see figures in both directions. Sometimes one, sometimes several, always motionless, always watching. They don't seem threatening exactly, just intensely interested in my daily routines. The other tenants in the building have stopped pretending not to see me. Now they nod when we pass, but their nods feel like recognition of something shared, some understanding I've finally achieved. The woman from 4B even smiled at me yesterday, and for just a moment, her eyes caught the light in a way that made them appear red. I've stopped questioning whether what I'm experiencing is real or imagined. The distinction feels increasingly irrelevant. What matters is adaptation, learning the new rules, understanding that my apartment exists in a space where normal logic doesn't apply. The ritual protects me, the red light guides me, and the figures in the corridor have become familiar companions rather than sources of fear. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I'm the only one who can see them, or if everyone in the building has their own version of the corridor ritual, their own red lights and watching figures, their own messages spelled out in refrigerated groceries. Maybe the whole world operates on these hidden protocols, and I'm just now learning to perceive the infrastructure that was always there. The refrigerator spelled out a new message this morning. Welcome home. I left it exactly as I found it. Story 12. The house on Juneau Avenue had been watching me long before I knew it was there. Evangeline's rental sat wedge-shaped between two towering Victorians, a narrow slice of 1940s modesty that seemed to shrink further each time I visited. The previous tenant had left suddenly, she'd mentioned once while sorting through mail still arriving in his name, bills and catalogs for someone called Dimitri Koss, forwarded and re-forwarded until the postmarks blurred into illegible smears. I should have paid attention to that detail, should have wondered why a man would abandon his mail, his forwarding address, his entire paper trail in a city like Milwaukee, where winter makes leaving a calculated risk. But I was distracted by other things. By the way, Evangeline's fingers traced absent patterns on my chest in the gray afternoon light. By the coffee shops we'd discovered in the Third Ward, the late-night conversations that stretched until dawn painted her bedroom walls amber. By the comfortable routine we'd fallen into, her teaching classes at the college 3 days a week, me working remotely from her kitchen table, the quiet domesticity that felt like trying on someone else's life. The house began its subtle campaign during my 3rd week of regular visits. Evangeline would leave around noon on Tuesdays and Thursdays, her footsteps echoing down the front stairs, car door slamming with that particular metallic finality of a 2010 Honda Civic that's seen too many Wisconsin winters. The sound would fade into the ambient hum of Juneau Avenue traffic, and I'd settle into the strange luxury of being alone in someone else's space. That's when the house would begin to breathe differently. The first incident happened during my shower on a Tuesday in late September. I'd been luxuriating under water pressure that somehow managed to be both aggressive and insufficient, a uniquely rental property phenomenon, when I noticed the vinyl curtain bulging inward. Not dramatically, just 2 fingers' width of indentation, as if someone had pressed their palm against the exterior and was testing the resistance. I stood there, water streaming down my face, watching the curtain hold that unnatural curve. The pressure behind it felt deliberate, patient. When I moved, it moved. Not away, but adjusting its position like something trying to maintain a clear line of sight. The rational explanation surfaced immediately. Old house, settling foundation, air pressure differential between the bathroom and hallway. I'd taken enough thermodynamics courses to construct a plausible theory, involving the forced air heating system and atmospheric variations. The kind of scientific reasoning that works perfectly until you're standing naked and vulnerable in someone else's bathtub, watching a shower curtain behave like it's conducting reconnaissance. I pressed my own palm against the indentation from the inside, feeling for whatever had caused it. Nothing. Just the give of cheap vinyl and the bathroom wall beyond it. But when I withdrew my hand, the bulge remained for several heartbeats before slowly, reluctantly, flattening back into place. The whisper started the following Thursday. I was working at Evangeline's kitchen table, a chrome-legged relic from the 1950s that wobbled despite my efforts to level it with folded napkins, when I became aware of conversation drifting from the living room. Not conversation exactly, the rhythm of conversation, the rise and fall of voices engaged in dialogue, but with all the actual words bleached out, as if I were hearing them through water or from several rooms away. I paused my typing, fingers suspended over the keyboard, and listened. The sound continued. Definitely two voices, one slightly higher than the other, taking turns in what seemed like casual discussion. The tone was neither urgent nor secretive, just the comfortable murmur of people who knew each other well, sharing unremarkable thoughts. When I stood to investigate, the voices stopped. Not abruptly, not like someone who'd been caught eavesdropping, but with the natural conclusion of a conversation that had simply run its course. I walked through the living room, checking behind the couch, peering out the windows at the narrow gap between houses. Nothing. The neighbors' houses were close enough to touch if you leaned out a second-story window, but both appeared empty in that middle-of-the-workday way. I returned to the kitchen table, reopened my laptop, and waited. Within minutes, the whispers resumed. This time I remained seated, letting them wash over me like audio wallpaper. Strangely, their presence became almost comforting, like working in a coffee shop where the ambient conversation provided a buffer against the oppressive silence of solitude. But coffee shop conversations don't stop the moment you pay attention to them. They don't seem to track your movements or adjust their volume based on your proximity. They don't create the persistent impression that they're discussing you without ever using your name. October brought shorter days and more frequent visits to Evangeline's place. The routine solidified, her afternoon departures, my solo hours in the house, the gradual accumulation of small irregularities that I began cataloging with the obsessive precision of someone trying to prove their own sanity. The shower curtain incident repeated with clockwork regularity. Always during my shower, always the same two-finger indentation, always positioned at what would be eye level for someone of average height standing in the bathroom. I started showering with the curtain fully open, but this only made me feel more exposed, more vulnerable to whatever was conducting its patient surveillance. The whispers became a daily occurrence, their timing eerily consistent. They would begin approximately 30 minutes after Evangeline's departure and continue in 15 to 20-minute segments with brief intermissions. I tried recording them with my phone, but the audio captured only the house's standard ambient sounds. The refrigerator's occasional cycle, the forced air heating kicking on, the distant hum of traffic. Whatever I was hearing apparently existed in a frequency range that electronic devices couldn't detect, or that my mind was generating independently. The thought crept in like cold air through a badly sealed window. I'd been spending increasing amounts of time alone in the house, working long hours on a project that was behind deadline, drinking more coffee than usual, sleeping poorly on Evangeline's too-soft mattress. Stress-induced auditory hallucinations were a documented phenomenon. The brain's pattern recognition systems could manufacture conversations from random noise when pushed beyond their normal operating parameters. But hallucinations didn't explain what happened with the soup. I was standing at the kitchen counter on a gray Thursday afternoon, speaking aloud to myself in the way that people who spend too much time alone often do. I'd been complaining about the house's quirks, the whispers that started precisely 37 minutes after Evangeline left, the shower curtain that seemed to have developed a voyeuristic streak, the way certain floorboards creaked in sequence as if something were pacing a predetermined route through the living room. "It's just old house settling," I said to the empty kitchen, my voice sounding strained and unfamiliar in the silence. "Just plumbing and thermal expansion and foundations adjusting to seasonal temperature variations. Just normal stuff that sounds weird when you're alone and overthinking everything." The soup can hit the counter with the sharp metallic crack of a minor collision. I spun around to find a can of Campbell's tomato soup, one I was certain had been securely positioned in the middle shelf of the cabinet, sitting upright on the counter approximately 3 feet from where it should have been. Not fallen, not rolled. sitting upright with the label facing me, as if it had been carefully placed there for maximum visibility. The cabinet door hung open, swaying almost imperceptibly on hinges that needed oil. I approached slowly, examining the shelf where the can had presumably originated. The other cans remained in their orderly rows, showing no evidence of disturbance. No gaps where the tomato soup had been, no indication that anything had been removed. I picked up the can, turned it over in my hands, looking for what? Dental marks from invisible teeth? Fingerprints from ghostly hands? It was simply a can of soup, room temperature, with the expiration date still 8 months in the future. But as I stood there holding it, I could swear I heard something like satisfied laughter from the living room. That evening, I mentioned the incident to Evangeline with carefully modulated casualness. She was cooking pasta, her back to me as she stirred the sauce, and I found it easier to talk about potentially supernatural experiences when I wasn't making direct eye contact. "The house has been making some interesting sounds when you're gone," I said, watching steam rise from the boiling water. "Old houses do that," she replied without turning around. "The previous tenant mentioned some quirks when I took over the lease, said the place had personality." "What kind of personality?" She shrugged, tasting the sauce from a wooden spoon. "He was kind of cryptic about it. Eastern European guy, very intense. Dimitri something. He moved out in the middle of the night, left half his stuff behind. The landlord had to change the locks because he never returned his keys." "Did he say anything specific about the sounds?" "Just that the house liked to know when people were home." She turned to face me then, her expression unreadable. "Why? Has it been bothering you?" I wanted to tell her about the whispers, about the shower curtain, about the soup can that had apparently teleported itself across the kitchen. Instead, I found myself shaking my head and reaching for the wine bottle. "Just curious. It's got a lot of character, like you said." But that night, lying in her bed while she slept peacefully beside me, I stared at the ceiling and wondered what exactly Dmitry Kos had experienced in this house. What had made him abandon his lease, his belongings, his forwarding address? What had convinced him to disappear in the middle of a Wisconsin winter rather than spend another night within these walls? November arrived with the first real snowfall, and with it, an escalation in the house's behavior. The whispers became more frequent, sometimes continuing for hours without interruption. Their content remained indecipherable, but their tone grew increasingly agitated, as if the invisible speakers were debating something urgent and couldn't reach consensus. I began to detect a third voice in the mix, lower and more gravelly than the other two, offering what sounded like corrections or contradictions. The shower curtain abandoned all pretense of subtlety. Now it would bulge inward dramatically, creating a silhouette that looked disturbingly human. Head, shoulders, torso pressed against the vinyl as if someone were leaning in for a closer look. I started taking showers at odd hours, hoping to disrupt whatever schedule the voyeuristic presence had established. But it adapted instantly to my new routine. Most disturbing were the new sounds, footsteps that followed a precise path from the living room to the kitchen, pausing at the threshold of each room as if something were checking the contents before moving on. The footsteps were too heavy to be Evangeline's, too deliberate to be random settling noises. They had weight, rhythm, purpose. I began working from a different location each day, sometimes the kitchen table, sometimes the living room couch, occasionally the small desk in Evangeline's bedroom. But no matter where I positioned myself, the footsteps would eventually find me, circling my location like a predator assessing its prey. By mid-November, I was averaging 3 hours of sleep per night. The kitchen renovation was Evangeline's idea. She'd been complaining about the outdated countertops and the cabinet doors that wouldn't close properly, and she'd finally convinced her landlord to invest in some basic improvements. The work was scheduled to begin on a Tuesday, one of her teaching days, which meant I'd be supervising the contractor while she was at the college. The carpenter arrived precisely at 8 a.m., a weathered man in his 60s who introduced himself simply as Boyd, and immediately began examining the kitchen with the intense focus of someone assessing structural integrity. He moved methodically through the space, tapping walls, opening and closing cabinet doors, making notes on a small pad that he kept in his shirt pocket. "You been having any problems with pests?" he asked, running his hand along the baseboard behind the sink. "What kind of pests?" "Mice, mostly. Sometimes rats if the previous tenant wasn't careful about food storage. I'm seeing some irregularities in the wood here that might indicate nesting activity." He knelt beside the cabinet and began working at the baseboard with a small pry bar. The wood came away easily, revealing a gap between the wall and the foundation that should have been filled with insulation. Instead, there was nothing, just empty space extending back into darkness. "Well, that's interesting," Boyd muttered, reaching into the gap with his flashlight. "Looks like we've got a little hollow area back here. Pretty good size, actually." He withdrew his hand, and with it came a small collection of objects, buttons of various sizes and materials, coins that looked older than anything currently in circulation, and a folded piece of paper that had yellowed with age. "Previous tenant leave these behind?" he asked, spreading the items on the counter. I picked up one of the coins, a wheat penny dated 1943, and examined it under the kitchen light. "I don't think so. The guy who lived here before was named Dmitri Koss. These look like they've been here much longer." Boyd unfolded the paper carefully, revealing handwriting in faded blue ink. At the top of the page, in careful cursive script, was a name, Eugene Vasquez. Below the name was what appeared to be a list, though the handwriting was difficult to decipher. I could make out individual words: Tuesday, kitchen, shower, watching, but the overall meaning remained elusive. "Friend of yours?" Boyd asked, pointing to the name. "Never heard of him." We both stared at the paper, at this artifact from some previous tenant's residence in the house. Eugene Vasquez, whoever he was, had apparently felt compelled to document something significant enough to hide behind a baseboard to preserve for future discovery. "What do you want to do with this stuff?" Boyd asked. I gathered the items, buttons, coins, the mysterious note, and slipped them into my laptop bag. "I'll ask the landlord about it. Might be historically significant." But even as I said it, I knew I had no intention of contacting the landlord. These objects felt important in a way I couldn't articulate, connected to the house's strange behavior in ways that logic couldn't support, but instinct insisted upon. Boyd continued his work, sealing the hollow space with expanding foam and new baseboard, eliminating the gap that had concealed Eugene Vasquez's hidden cache for who knew how many years. The process took most of the morning, and when he finished, the kitchen looked exactly as it had before, except for the absence of that small, secret void. That afternoon, after Boyd had packed up his tools and departed, I sat alone at the kitchen table and experienced something I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Silence. Complete, unbroken silence. No whispers from the living room. No footsteps pacing their familiar circuit. No sounds at all except the usual mechanical hums and electrical whispers that every house produces. Even the shower curtain, when I tested it during my afternoon shower, hung perfectly still. The house had gone mute. For 3 days, I basked in the unexpected peace. I worked productively, slept through the night, felt my stress levels diminish to something approaching normal. The objects from the hollow space sat in my laptop bag, temporarily forgotten in the relief of living without constant supernatural surveillance. But on Saturday morning, while Evangeline was at the farmer's market and I was enjoying coffee in the blissfully quiet kitchen, I decided to examine Eugene Vasquez's note more carefully. The handwriting, while faded, was more legible than I'd initially thought. What I'd taken for a random list was actually a detailed log, entries dated and timed with obsessive precision. Tuesday, 2:15 p.m. Voices in living room, 2 distinct speakers, duration approximately 18 minutes. Thursday, 1:47 p.m. Shower curtain displacement, consistent with previous observations. Friday, 3:22 p.m. Kitchen cabinet disturbance, soup can relocated without apparent cause. Saturday, 11:30 a.m. Footsteps, living room to kitchen, pattern matches previous recordings. The entries continued for several pages, documenting incidents that matched my own experiences with uncanny accuracy. Eugene Vasquez had been cataloging the exact same phenomena I'd been experiencing, down to specific times and behavioral patterns. At the bottom of the final page, in slightly shakier handwriting, was a longer entry. They know I'm documenting their activities. The sounds have become more frequent, more aggressive. Dimitri was right. Sealing the space might stop them temporarily, but they always find another way in. The house remembers everything that happens within its walls. Every tenant, every conversation, every secret. We're not just living here, we're being archived. If you're reading this, you've already begun to hear them. The voices, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched. You've probably told yourself it's just old house noises, just your imagination, just stress. That's what I told myself. What Dimitri told himself. What the tenant before him must have told himself. But we're all still here, in a way. All of us who've lived within these walls, who've contributed our voices to the house's collection. Listen carefully during the whispers. You might recognize some of them. The paper slipped from my hands as I understood what Eugene Vasquez was suggesting, that the voices I'd been hearing weren't random supernatural phenomena, but recordings, echoes of previous tenants preserved somehow within the house's structure, playing back their conversations, their daily routines, their growing awareness that they were not alone. That Dimitri Kos, whose mail still arrived months after his midnight departure, might still be here in some form. That Eugene Vasquez, who had hidden this note behind a baseboard like a message in a bottle, might still be pacing his invisible circuit through the living room. That I, with my solo conversations in the kitchen, my muttered complaints about the house's quirks, my increasingly paranoid attempts to rationalize the unexplainable, was adding my voice to their collection. The silence that had followed the sealing of the hollow space suddenly felt less like resolution and more like the calm before a storm. The house hadn't been silenced. It had been preparing, learning, adapting to the loss of its previous hiding place. As I sat there in Evangeline's kitchen, surrounded by the perfectly ordinary sounds of a Saturday morning, traffic, distant music, the neighbor's dog barking, I became aware that I was holding my breath, listening for the first sign that the house had found a new way to store its memories. And in the distance, just barely audible above the ambient noise of the city, I could swear I heard the sound of whispers beginning again. Familiar voices engaged in comfortable conversation, discussing nothing and everything in words I couldn't quite distinguish. One of the voices, I realized with a chill that seemed to originate from somewhere deeper than bone, sounded remarkably like my own. Story 13. The inheritance arrived on a Tuesday that tasted of rain and regret. 3 boxes from Providence, each bearing my aunt's spidery handwriting, delivered to my downtown apartment by a moving company that charged twice their estimate and left muddy footprints across my hardwood floors. I should have known then that everything she touched carried a price. The Harlequin emerged from the 3rd box, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper that crumbled at my touch. Victorian porcelain, roughly 8 inches tall, painted in faded diamonds of blue and gold that had once been vibrant. His face bore that characteristic theatrical mask, half smile, half sorrow, with eyes that seemed to follow the light regardless of angle. Aunt Cordelia had displayed him prominently in her crystal cabinet, I remembered, always centered among her collection of figurines like a ringmaster among his troupe. I placed him on the bookshelf in my home office, nestled between a leather-bound dictionary and a collection of architectural drawings. He looked smaller there, almost humble, his porcelain hands frozen mid-gesture, as if perpetually introducing an invisible act. The late afternoon sun caught his glazed surface, and for a moment, those painted eyes seemed to shimmer with something approaching consciousness. That night, I worked late on blueprints for a downtown renovation. The only sounds the scratching of my pencil and the building's ancient radiator coughing to life. Around midnight, I stretched and glanced toward the shelf. The Harlequin stared back, unchanged, yet something felt different. The shadows around him seemed deeper, more purposeful. I blamed fatigue and went to bed. I woke to find him on my bedroom threshold. He stood on the hardwood just inside the doorframe, angled toward my bed with that same theatrical pose, but now facing me directly. The morning light streaming through my curtains caught the gold diamonds on his costume, casting tiny reflections that danced across the opposite wall. My first thought was earthquake, We'd had minor tremors recently, but nothing else in the apartment had shifted. Books remained aligned on shelves, picture frames hung straight. Even the glass of water on my nightstand sat undisturbed. I carried him back to the office shelf, checking for chips or cracks that might indicate he'd fallen. The porcelain felt smooth and intact under my fingers, though something about the texture seemed different. More porous, perhaps, as if the glaze had somehow loosened overnight. The second relocation happened 3 days later. This time I found him on the kitchen counter, positioned near the coffee maker with his painted gaze fixed on the refrigerator. The morning ritual of discovery was becoming unsettling. That moment of recognition followed by the creeping certainty that I hadn't placed him there. I began photographing his position each evening before bed, creating a digital record of his placement. The photos showed him exactly where I'd left him, centered on the bookshelf, yet each morning brought a new location. By the end of the week, I'd moved him to a clear plastic storage container with a secure lid, the kind used for Christmas decorations. I labeled it Fragile in permanent marker and placed it on the highest shelf in my bedroom closet. The transparency allowed me to monitor him without daily handling, and the container would prevent any movement, assuming movement was even possible. The first hairline crack appeared 2 mornings later. It ran from his left temple down to the corner of his mouth, barely visible unless you knew where to look. I removed him from the container and examined the fissure under a magnifying glass. The crack was fresh, the exposed porcelain beneath bright white against the aged surface. More concerning was its precision. The line followed the natural contours of his painted features, as if traced by an expert hand. Each dawn brought new fractures, thin lines spreading from his fingertips, a spiderweb of damage across his back, microscopic gaps that appeared overnight like frost patterns on a window. The cracks formed no discernible pattern, yet their placement seemed deliberate, as if something inside was slowly working its way out. I contacted a restoration specialist recommended by the local museum, a soft-spoken woman with calloused hands who examined antiques the way doctors study X-rays. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon, bringing specialized tools and a skeptical expression that changed the moment she lifted the harlequin from his container. "These microfissures are recent," she confirmed, turning the figure under her desk lamp. "The porcelain is expanding and contracting repeatedly, which suggests temperature fluctuation or internal pressure. But that's impossible with a solid casting this old." She set him down carefully, her fingers lingering on the base. "Where did you say you keep him?" I explained the closet container, the consistent temperature, the careful handling. She listened with growing confusion, occasionally returning her attention to the figurine as if expecting him to provide answers. "The patterns are consistent with vibrational damage," she finally said, "as if he's been subjected to constant tremors or oscillation. But there's something else." She pointed to the newest crack, a delicate line that curved around his throat like a necklace. "This occurred within the last 24 hours, and the edges show signs of microscopic debris, dust particles that have been pressed into the fissure. That only happens with active movement." After she left, I placed the harlequin back in his container and sealed it inside a second box, cushioned with foam padding. The setup reminded me of those Russian nesting dolls, each layer designed to contain what couldn't be contained. I positioned the box on my desk where I could monitor it while working. The scratching began that night. Soft at first, like fingernails against fabric, coming from the direction of my desk. I attributed it to mice in the walls or settling wood until I realized the sound was too rhythmic, too purposeful. It came in measured intervals. Scratch, pause, scratch, pause, as if something was testing the boundaries of its confinement. I opened the outer box with trembling hands. The inner container remained sealed, the harlequin visible through the clear plastic. But something had changed. His position had shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough to notice. His head was turned further toward the left, and one arm had moved from its theatrical gesture to what appeared to be a pointing motion. But it was his ear that made my breath catch. A tiny earring hung from his left lobe, so small I might have missed it without the desk lamp's direct illumination. The jewelry was exquisite, a miniature pearl set in what looked like gold filigree, catching the light with an intensity that seemed impossible for something so diminutive. The craftsmanship was Victorian, matching the period of the figurine, but the metal held a polish that spoke of recent care. I photographed the earring from multiple angles, my camera struggling to capture its brilliance. In the images, it appeared as little more than a bright spot, but in person, it seemed to pulse with its own inner light. When I touched it with a cotton swab, it moved freely on its post, clearly designed to be worn rather than permanently attached. The restoration specialist returned the following day, her professional composure cracking when she saw the earring. "This wasn't here yesterday," she stated flatly. "I examined every inch of this piece. There was no jewelry, no attachment points, nothing that would suggest modification." She removed the earring with tweezers and examined it under her magnifying equipment. The pearl was genuine, she confirmed, and the setting showed signs of age consistent with the Victorian period. But the polish was fresh, applied recently with evident care. "Someone has access to your apartment," she concluded. "This level of craftsmanship, the matching period, this isn't a prank. Someone who understands antique jewelry has been here." But my apartment was on the 4th floor, accessible only by a keycard elevator. The building had security cameras, electronic locks, no maintenance scheduled. I'd lived alone for 3 years without incident, and none of my neighbors had mentioned seeing strangers in the hallways. That evening, I installed a motion-activated camera focused on my desk. The device promised to send alerts to my phone whenever movement triggered its sensors, creating a digital sentinel that would solve the mystery through simple observation. I woke to 17 motion alerts. The timestamp showed activity throughout the night, but the recorded footage revealed nothing unusual. Each clip showed my empty desk, the sealed boxes exactly as I'd left them, no human figures or obvious disturbances. Yet something had triggered the camera's sensors repeatedly, capturing minutes of seemingly static scenes that felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. I fast-forwarded through the recordings, looking for any detail I might have missed. The Harlequin remained visible through his transparent container, motionless and contained, but the lighting in each clip seemed subtly different. Shadows shifted without apparent cause, and the reflections on his glazed surface changed angle in ways that didn't correspond to any external light source. In the final clip, recorded just before dawn, his head was positioned differently. The change was minimal, a slight rotation to the right, barely perceptible without comparison to earlier footage, but undeniable. Frame by frame, the movement was invisible, yet the cumulative result was clear. He was turning to face my bedroom door. I sealed the containers inside a metal filing cabinet and moved the entire setup to my building's storage unit in the basement. The concrete-walled space had no windows, minimal lighting, and a humidity that made my skin crawl, but it seemed appropriately tomb-like for whatever the Harlequin was becoming. For 2 days I enjoyed the illusion of normalcy. My apartment felt lighter, the shadows less oppressive, the silence no longer pregnant with potential movement. I began to convince myself that the problem was psychological: stress, isolation, the suggestion of supernatural activity creating actual symptoms through the power of expectation. Then the earring appeared on my nightstand. I found it Thursday morning, positioned carefully on the wooden surface beside my alarm clock. The tiny pearl caught the early light streaming through my bedroom window, its surface reflecting more illumination than physics should allow. It sat there like an accusation, impossible to explain, yet undeniably present. I hadn't been to the storage unit since depositing the filing cabinet. The basement remained locked, accessible only by residents with key cards that logged entry times. The building management confirmed no one had accessed the storage area, and my own card showed no activity since Tuesday afternoon. Yet here was the earring, polished to perfection and positioned with obvious intentionality. I returned to the basement storage unit with building security, a middle-aged guard whose skepticism dissolved when we opened the filing cabinet. The outer box remained sealed with tape, the inner container intact, but the Harlequin was gone. In his place lay a small piece of aged paper, folded neatly and weighted down with a Victorian coin. The writing was in faded ink, the handwriting unmistakably my aunt's. Some gifts choose their recipients. The earring belongs to whomever needs to listen most carefully. He was never mine to give, only mine to keep until the right person came along. You'll understand when you start hearing the voices he collects. I folded the note and pocketed it, my hands shaking with something beyond fear. The storage unit suddenly felt smaller, its concrete walls pressing inward with claustrophobic insistence. The security guard was asking questions I couldn't answer, making observations about theft and investigation that seemed to come from another universe entirely. That night I lay in bed listening to sounds that shouldn't exist. Whispers in the walls, footsteps in the hallway outside my locked door, the soft scraping of porcelain against hardwood somewhere in the darkness of my apartment. The earring sat on my nightstand like a lighthouse beacon, its impossible brightness casting shadows that moved independently of any light source. I understand now why Aunt Cordelia kept him in her crystal cabinet, surrounded by other figures that could share the weight of observation. He was never decoration or art. He was a collector, gathering voices and stories and secrets from everyone who looked too long into those painted eyes. The microfissures weren't damage. They were expansion joints, accommodating growth that had nothing to do with porcelain and everything to do with accumulation. Each crack represented another voice added to his collection, another story absorbed into his glazed surface. And now he's somewhere in my apartment, listening. I can feel his presence in the peripheral spaces where sight meets imagination, in the moments between sleep and waking when reality becomes negotiable. The earring pulses with gentle light beside my bed, marking time like a metronome for madness. And I realize that some inheritances cannot be returned or discarded or stored away. They can only be accepted. The question that keeps me awake isn't whether he's real or imagined, supernatural or psychological. The question is whether it matters. Something is collecting voices in the darkness of my apartment, and I'm beginning to understand that mine might be the next one added to his repertoire. The scratching has started again, soft but insistent, coming from somewhere behind my bedroom wall. It sounds almost like applause. Story 14. The smell hit me first. Wood shavings mixed with rust and something else. Something organic that made my throat tighten. I'd been standing at the entrance to grandfather's basement workshop for 10 minutes, key heavy in my palm, unable to cross the threshold. The real estate agent had called it a charming period basement. But even through her practiced enthusiasm, I'd heard the hesitation when she mentioned the workshop remained mostly intact. 3 months since the funeral, and I'd avoided this corner of the house like a quarantine zone. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, each groan echoing off stone walls that seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it. My flashlight beam carved weak arcs through air thick with decades of sawdust and neglect. Workbenches lined the walls like sleeping giants, their surfaces cluttered with tools I couldn't name, projects abandoned mid-creation. But in the far corner, exactly where memory insisted it would be, sat the sharpening bench. My grandfather had spent hours there, hunched over whetstones and grinding wheels, bringing dull edges back to life. The rhythm of steel against stone had been the soundtrack of my childhood visits, a steady, meditative scraping that seemed to pulse with the house's heartbeat. Now the bench sat silent, its leather strap cracked and brittle, the grinding wheel motionless. I approached slowly, flashlight trembling in my grip. The bench looked smaller than I remembered, more humble, but the weight of its presence hadn't diminished. Tool handles worn smooth by decades of use jutted from wooden slots. A magnifying glass on an articulated arm hung suspended over the workspace like a mechanical spider. And there, carved into the bench's edge in letters so faded I had to trace them with my fingertip, were my grandfather's initials, H.R. Henry Rothstein, dead at 87, taking with him 60 years of craftsmanship secrets and an equal measure of unspoken stories. I ran my hand along the bench's surface, feeling grooves worn by countless blades. The wood was still stained dark in places, oil maybe, or something else that time had made permanent. My fingers found a depression near the center, perfectly sized for a thumb, and I pressed down without thinking. The grinding wheel spun, just a quarter turn, silent as breath, but enough to make me jerk my hand back and stumble against the opposite wall. Dust rained from the ceiling beam above my head. The wheel had stopped, motionless again, but I could swear I still heard the whisper of its rotation in the air. My heartbeat filled the silence. Too loud, too fast. Old houses settled, that's all. Foundations shifted. Floorboards above had probably creaked and transmitted vibrations through the frame. Logical explanations cued themselves in my mind like patients in a waiting room, each more reasonable than the last. But logic couldn't explain why the wheel had spun backward. I left the basement that night with more questions than answers, but it was the dreams that really started the unraveling. The first one came 3 days later. I was standing on a granite veranda that stretched endlessly in both directions, its surface polished to mirror brightness. A single bench sat in the center, not wood like grandfather's, but carved from the same stone as the floor. Behind me, a wall rose higher than I could see, punctuated by doors arranged in perfect vertical columns. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, each identical in size and shape, fitted with brass handles that gleamed like captured sunlight. The doors extended up and down beyond my vision, as if I stood on a ledge spanning the middle of some impossible shaft. Above and below, the columns of doors faded into darkness. A faint sound echoed from the depths, metal against stone, the familiar rhythm of sharpening. Then he was beside me, settling onto the bench with the careful precision of age. Grandfather looked exactly as he had 20 years ago. Work shirt rolled to the elbows, hands marked with scars from decades of blade work, those same canvas sneakers he'd worn until they fell apart. He smiled and reached into his pocket, extracting something that caught the light. A key. Brass, heavy, its head worn smooth by handling. He placed it in my palm without a word, his skin paper dry against mine, and the weight of it was substantial, real, more solid than anything else in this impossible place. I tried to speak, to ask what the key opened, but sound wouldn't come. He just nodded toward the wall of doors, that gentle expression I remembered from childhood unchanged. The scraping sound grew louder, more urgent, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I woke gasping, lungs burning as if I'd been holding my breath for hours. My mouth tasted of dust and something metallic that made my tongue feel thick. The key was gone, of course, but my closed fist still ached from gripping something that had felt absolutely real. The taste lingered all morning, metal and grit that no amount of coffee could wash away. 2 weeks passed before I returned to the basement. The dreams had continued, variations on the same theme, the granite veranda, the endless wall of doors. Grandfather handing me keys of different shapes and sizes, sometimes brass, sometimes steel, once silver so tarnished it looked black. Always the same weight, always solid until the moment I woke to find my hands empty. The basement felt different now, charged with possibility I couldn't name. I'd told myself I was coming back to sort through tools to prepare for an estate sale, but that was a lie. I was looking for something, though I couldn't have said what. The sharpening bench drew me like gravity. I'd brought a proper flashlight this time, heavy and bright, but its beams seemed reluctant to illuminate certain corners. Shadows clung to spaces they shouldn't occupy, thick as velvet, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than the empty room warranted. The padlock stopped me cold. I'd been in this basement dozens of times as a child, had run my hands over every surface, explored every corner. There had never been a locked door here, never been any door at all in the wall behind the sharpening bench. But there it was. Rough wooden planks fitted into a frame I could swear hadn't existed before, secured with a padlock so old its brass surface had turned green-black with age. The lock hung heavy from a hasp that seemed to have grown from the wood itself, metal fused with grain until they were inseparable. Rust had welded the shackle closed decades ago, or so it appeared. No key I could imagine would fit that corroded mass, but I had to try. The brass key from my dream materialized in my pocket like it had been waiting there all along. My rational mind screamed protests, listed the impossibilities, demanded explanations I couldn't provide. But my fingers closed around familiar weight, familiar warmth, and when I drew it out, the metal gleamed as if freshly polished. It shouldn't have fit. The keyhole was a twisted mess of rust and debris, the opening barely visible, but the key slid home with the ease of long practice. turned with a click that seemed to echo through the foundations of the house, and the shackle fell open with a sound like a sigh. The door swung inward on hinges that moved silently despite their obvious age. Beyond lay darkness that my flashlight couldn't penetrate, air that moved against my face with the breath of deep places. The smell that emerged was familiar now, dust and rust and that organic undertone I still couldn't identify. I should have left then. Every instinct I possessed screamed warnings, raised alarm bells, flooded my system with adrenaline meant for flight. But the darkness beyond that door held answers to questions I was only beginning to understand how to ask. The space beyond was larger than the basement had room for, carved from living rock that wept moisture in thin streams. My footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sound was being stretched through dimensions I couldn't perceive. The flashlight beam revealed rough-hewn walls that curved away into shadow, and there, perhaps 50 feet ahead, the faint outline of something rectangular, a glass case positioned like an altar in the chamber's center. Each step toward it required effort, as if the air itself resisted my approach. The case was old, its glass clouded with age, but I could make out the contents: photographs, newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, all yellow with time, all carefully arranged like evidence in a trial that had never taken place. The photographs showed the sharpening bench from different angles, different time periods judging by the varying states of the tools and workspace. But in each one, barely visible in the shadows behind the bench, was a figure. Tall, indistinct, more suggestion than substance. Sometimes it appeared to be standing, sometimes seated, but always present, always watching the work being done. The newspaper clippings were from the local paper, spanning decades. Missing persons reports, mostly, but also obituaries, accident reports, stories of people who'd simply vanished from their lives without explanation. The connection wasn't obvious until I read the handwritten notes paperclipped to each article. Saw him at the bench again last night. H.R. Third time this week. He's getting clearer. H.R. I think he wants me to finish something. H.R. The tools know his touch. I'm just the hands now. H.R. My grandfather's writing, documenting encounters with something that had no name, no form I could understand. The dates on the notes stretched back 30 years, the handwriting growing more erratic toward the end, the observations more fragmented. Can't sleep. He's there even when the lights are on. The wheel turns by itself now. Metal shavings on the floor every morning. I know what he's sharpening. The last note was dated just 2 months before grandfather's death. The paper was different, newer, the handwriting barely recognizable as his. He's not alone anymore. They come to watch. The bench remembers every blade, every edge, every hand that guided steel to stone. I understand now why it can't stop, why it won't stop. The work isn't finished. Below that, in pencil so faint I had to squint to read it. The key chooses who comes next. The glass case began to rattle. At first, I thought it was my hands shaking, tremors of fear making the flashlight beam dance across the surface. But the rattling grew stronger, more purposeful, and I realized the vibration was coming from somewhere else, somewhere deeper. The sound of metal against stone echoed through the chamber, that familiar rhythm I'd heard in dreams and childhood memories. But now it was wrong somehow, too fast, too urgent, as if whatever was doing the sharpening was running out of time. I backed toward the entrance, but the sound followed, growing louder with each step. The darkness behind me felt solid now, pressing against my shoulders, and when I turned the flashlight toward the tunnel I'd entered through, the beam revealed nothing but black stone. The way out was gone. Panic rose like bile in my throat. I spun in circles, light cutting wild arcs through the chamber, but every direction showed only walls, only stone, only the glass case sitting in the center like an accusation. The grinding sound reached a crescendo, metal screaming against stone in harmonies that made my teeth ache. Then it stopped. Silence rushed back like water filling a vacuum, so complete it seemed to have weight. Even my breathing sounded thunderous in the stillness. I stood frozen, afraid to move, afraid to make any sound that might bring back that terrible grinding. That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere above my head. Boot soles against wood. The familiar creak of the basement stairs. Someone descending toward the workshop. But I was in the chamber behind the locked door, and the locked door was gone. The wall behind me showed only smooth stone. No trace of the passage I'd used to enter. I was sealed in, trapped with the glass case and its collection of evidence, listening to footsteps that couldn't exist approach from a direction that made no geometric sense. The grinding sound began again, but softer now, patient. The rhythm I remembered from childhood, steady and sure. The sound of someone who knew their craft. Mixed with it came other sounds. The whisper of leather stropping, the ping of steel testing edge sharpness, the soft scrape of metal being drawn across palm skin to check for burrs. Someone was working at the sharpening bench. The footsteps had stopped, replaced by those familiar workshop sounds, and I knew with certainty that wouldn't tolerate examination, that if I could somehow see through stone walls and impossible distances, I would find a figure hunched over the grinding wheel. Not my grandfather, his hands had been stilled months ago, but the other one, the shape in the photographs, the presence that had watched decades of work with patience that stretched beyond human comprehension. The key in my pocket grew warm, then hot, until I had to pull it out or risk burns through the fabric. It glowed now with its own light. Brass turned molten gold, and I understood with sick certainty that this had all been orchestrated. The dreams, the locked door, the key that shouldn't exist. All steps in a process I'd walked into blindly. The grinding stopped again. In the silence, I heard my name whispered by a voice that sounded like grinding stone, like metal shavings falling to concrete, like the final sigh of something sharp finding its perfect edge. Not spoken aloud, but carved directly into my consciousness with tools I couldn't name. The glass case cracked down the middle. Through the split, papers began to rustle. Photographs fluttered like living things, and new documents appeared as if materializing from the air itself. Fresh newspaper clippings, recent missing persons reports, and there, impossible but undeniable, a photograph of me standing at the sharpening bench, taken from an angle that suggested the photographer had been standing exactly where I stood now. In the photograph, barely visible in the shadows behind me, was the figure from all the others. But clearer now, more solid, as if my presence had given it definition it had previously lacked. And it was closer to the bench than it had ever been in the older pictures, close enough that its hand appeared to rest on mine as I gripped a blade I didn't remember holding. The key burned against my palm like a brand. I understood then that the chamber wasn't a hiding place but a workshop, not for blades, but for hands. The grinding sound wasn't metal against stone but will against will, choice ground down to its essential edge. The figure in the photographs hadn't been watching the work. It had been selecting the workers, waiting for hands that could complete something my grandfather had started but couldn't finish. The photographs showed the progression clearly now that I knew how to look. Different people across different decades, all standing at the same bench, all with the same shape growing more solid behind them. All of them with their hands positioned exactly as mine had been in that impossible final image. All of them gone now, according to the clippings. All of them replaced. The key in my hand began to change, its surface shifting like liquid metal, adapting itself to locks I couldn't see, doors I'd never imagined. It was becoming part of me, or I was becoming part of it, the boundary between flesh and brass growing uncertain. When I flexed my fingers, I heard the tiny scrape of metal against bone. Above me, impossibly, the grinding sound began again. But now I could feel it in my hands, the vibration traveling through stone and space to settle in my palms. My fingers moved without conscious direction, following motions burned into muscle memory I'd never made, and I knew that somewhere above, in a basement workshop that might or might not still exist, something was being sharpened to an edge that would cut through more than metal. The crack in the glass case widened, and through it, I caught a glimpse of handwriting I recognized as my own, though I had no memory of forming the words. The wheel turns by itself now. I understand what he's been waiting for. The paper was dated today. I've been in this chamber for hours now, or maybe days, Time moves strangely in places that shouldn't exist. The grinding sound comes and goes, sometimes distant, sometimes so close it seems to originate inside my skull. The key has cooled in my palm, but I can still feel its weight even when I set it down, as if it's become part of my essential mass. I keep writing because the motion of pen against paper drowns out other sounds, other whispers, other offers made in voices that sound increasingly like my own. The chamber has grown larger since I arrived, or perhaps I've grown smaller. The glass case is whole again, its contents rearranged to include documents I don't remember creating but recognize as necessary. Soon, I think, someone else will inherit my grandfather's house. They'll find the basement workshop, feel drawn to the sharpening bench, discover the padlock that shouldn't exist on a door that wasn't there before. They'll dream of granite verandas and endless doors, and in their dreams, an old man will hand them a key that weighs more than physics should allow. The key will fit perfectly, because it's been shaped by hands that know the work it must open. The grinding sound has started again, patient and sure. Above me, impossibly distant and intimately close, something waits at a sharpening bench, ready to guide new hands through motions that were old when the foundation stones were first laid. I set down my pen and pick up the key. The work continues.